Welcome. Go ahead and find the most comfortable position you can. Let the tension in your shoulders release. Let your breathing slow just a little. If tonight is your first time here, go ahead and subscribe before you drift off. It takes just a moment, and then you can let everything go. There is nothing you need to do right now, nowhere you need to be. The night is quiet and so are we. Tonight we are going somewhere most of us have visited before, in small flashes of memory, in the glow of a television screen, from a different and perhaps simpler chapter of life. We are going beneath the ocean, to a place where the sun still somehow shines through the water, where the light always has that soft, warm amber quality, and where the residents of one very small and very particular community managed, without really trying, to become some of the most beloved characters ever drawn into existence. There is a particular stretch of years in animation history that people who care deeply about the craft tend to return to again and again, not because the era was especially expensive or because it was technically groundbreaking in any way that made headlines at the time, but because something rarer happened during those years, something harder to manufacture and genuinely impossible to fake. The people making the work simply loved it. And that love has a way of surviving everything else. It presses itself into the frames of every episode. It lives in the background details and the musical choices and the small, strange moments that no one could have predicted would matter as much as they do decades later, to so many people who encountered them as children and find them still waiting, unchanged, when they return. The era we are travelling through tonight stretches across a run of episodes produced in the years when the animated programme set in an underwater town called Bikini Bottom was still being guided, with great care and very deliberate intention, by its original creator. Stephen Hillenburg was a marine biologist before he was an animator, and that background shaped everything about the show, from the way the characters moved through water to the specific colours of the light filtering down from above. Hillenburg had spent years studying actual ocean ecosystems, had worked as a marine educator, had stood in front of tanks full of living creatures and tried to explain their strangeness to people who had never thought much about what lived beneath the surface. And all of that patient attention to the actual world found its way into the world he invented, giving Bikini Bottom a quality of ecological specificity that no one could have predicted and that very few animated programs have achieved since. By this particular run of episodes, the show had found its stride completely. The voice cast had settled into their characters the way experienced actors settle into long-running stage roles, with a kind of second-nature ease that allows for surprise rather than requiring constant concentration on the basics. The writing room had developed a shared language, a set of shared instincts about what the show was at its core and what it very deliberately was not. And the animation, which had always been expressive and bold and slightly more physical than most of its contemporaries, had reached a kind of confident peak where everything seemed both effortless and precise at the same time. The backgrounds in these episodes are worth slowing down to consider on their own. They are painted with a warmth and a specific kind of tropical light that does something to the viewer that is genuinely difficult to articulate, but very easy to feel. The colour palette is rich without being garish. The underwater world has a quality of illumination that suggests sunlight filtered through very clear, very warm water, a specific shade of blue-green ambient light with golden highlights that appears nowhere else, and that has become, for many people, the visual signature of a very particular period in their lives. This palette was the result of deliberate choices made by the show's art director, Nick Jennings, who came from a background in traditional cell animation and brought to the show a sense of colour as emotional information, as something that communicates not just what things look like, but how they feel. The episode that opens this particular run of episodes is one in which Plankton and Mr. Krabs essentially trade lives for a day. Plankton, who has spent every waking hour trying to steal the Krabby Patty secret formula from the Krusty Krab, wakes up to find himself in possession of the Krusty Krab. He has customers, he has success, he has the thing he has always wanted. And then, almost immediately, the weight of it begins to close in around him. SpongeBob materializes, relentlessly enthusiastic, calling him Sir, asking for guidance, radiating goodwill of such concentrated intensity that it becomes its own kind of pressure. Meanwhile, Mr. Krabs finds himself in the chum bucket, alone and uncelebrated, and seems, for just a brief and quietly extraordinary moment, to understand something he had never once paused to consider about his own life. The premise borrows loosely from the idea that the grass is always greener on the other side, and the episode does not pretend otherwise. But what elevates it is not the premise itself, it is the execution. The episode uses the scenario to reveal character in ways that a normal episode could not, because the characters are operating outside their usual contexts, and the strangeness of those new contexts forces responses that illuminate something true. Plankton discovers that having what you want does not automatically feel like what you imagined. Mr. Krabs discovers that what he has built, even if he built it primarily out of greed, has its own strange value that he cannot perceive when he is inside it. These are small and patient observations, delivered through comedy, but they are genuine. Across all of these episodes, there is a character who tends to receive somewhat less attention than the main trio of SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward, but who functions as one of the most quietly important presences in the entire series. Sandy Cheeks, the Texan scientist and karate enthusiast who lives in an air dome beneath the ocean, is remarkable for a number of reasons, not least of which is that she is, consistently and without exception, the most competent person in almost every scene she enters. Sandy is a rocket scientist, a martial artist, an inventor, a naturalist, a guitarist, and a person who deals with the considerable logistical challenge of being the only air-breathing mammal in an underwater community, with a kind of practical, cheerful efficiency that is, when you stop to think about it, genuinely heroic. Carolyn Lawrence, who voices Sandy, brings to the character a quality of warm directness that grounds all of Sandy's competence in something approachable, a Texas cadence that suggests someone who grew up with more space than most people and developed, as a result, a certain comfortable relationship with scale, with the bigness of problems that do not intimidate her, with the distance between where something is and where it needs to be. The episode most associated with Sandy during this period is the one in which she challenges the rest of the main cast to prove that land creatures are not inherently better adapted than sea creatures. It is an episode built from a single, slightly absurd argument, and it pursues that argument with the cheerful dedication the show brings to every premise it commits to. Sandy removes her helmet and immediately begins to struggle beneath the water. SpongeBob, in a gesture of solidarity that is entirely characteristic of him, attempts to exist on dry land, and immediately begins to wither and shrink in ways that are both comedically spectacular and somehow genuinely moving. The whole thing is played as comedy, but beneath the comedy there is something honest being said about the nature of belonging, about the idea that every creature, however capable and however accomplished, is ultimately shaped by the specific place and conditions that made it. One of the most quietly magnificent episodes from this run is one that almost no one considers in isolation, because it seems, on its surface, like a perfectly ordinary installment. SpongeBob and Patrick are given a task. They are to paint the interior walls of Mr. Krabs' house using a special paint, and the central rule, established early and clearly, is that this paint, should it touch anything other than the walls, cannot be removed by any known means. It is permanent. It is irreversible. The rule is established. And then, naturally, inevitably, the rest of the episode is SpongeBob and Patrick slowly and catastrophically covering everything in sight with the permanent paint, while experiencing levels of escalating dread that would not be out of place in a much more serious kind of story. What makes this episode so brilliant in its quiet way is the use of a simple rule to generate genuine suspense. We know the rule. We know what the paint does. And so every brushstroke that drifts too close to a piece of furniture, every moment of Patrick's legendary spatial unawareness, every drop that hovers for just a half second too long before landing somewhere it absolutely should not land, generates something that operates as actual tension within the conventions of comedy. And then the ending arrives, and with a confidence that only a creative team at the top of its form could deploy, the episode completely undermines everything it has built, and does so in the final 30 seconds, and does so in a way that feels like a gift rather than a betrayal. Mr. Krabs' tears wash the paint away. He has been testing them the whole time, and the look on SpongeBob's face in that moment, moving through shock and relief and a dawning, complicated reckoning with what has just occurred, is one of the single best pieces of character performance in the entire run of the show. Clancy Brown, who provides the voice of Mr. Krabs, is an actor with one of the most distinctive voices in American entertainment. A career that has encompassed prestige drama, science fiction, horror, and animation in ways that few actors manage. Brown's Mr. Krabs is built from a specific set of contradictions that he holds simultaneously and effortlessly throughout every scene. The character is fundamentally and enthusiastically venal. He is driven almost entirely by the acquisition of money and the avoidance of spending it, and this drive is not softened or apologised for by the show, which presents it as simply the fact of who Mr. Krabs is. And yet Brown brings something warmly eccentric to the performance, a theatrical delight in the character's own appetites, a sense of someone who has fully accepted himself and finds that acceptance genuinely enjoyable. The voice is mid-Atlantic, slightly nautical, with an accent that does not quite correspond to anywhere that exists on land, and Brown uses it with enormous precision, particularly in the character's laugh, a rolling, rising cackle that activates at the precise moment money enters a scene. And that is, 2 decades on, still one of the most immediately recognizable sounds in the entire series. Tom Kenny, who voices SpongeBob, has spoken in various interviews about the specific physical relationship he developed with the character, about the way he thinks of SpongeBob, not simply as a voice performance, but as a whole body of movement that expresses itself through sound. SpongeBob's voice is famously high and bright and slightly raspy, an eager, earnest instrument that manages to convey both tremendous enthusiasm and tremendous vulnerability at the same time, often within a single line. Kenny has described the process of finding the character as discovering a specific emotional register, a way of being that is fundamentally and unshakably optimistic and fundamentally and unshakably open in a world that is constantly, cheerfully, and completely indifferent to both of those qualities. There is something in the voice that never quite calcifies, that stays soft and slightly surprised, as if SpongeBob is perpetually encountering the world for the very first time and perpetually finding it interesting. Roger Bumpass, who voices Squidward Tentacles, is working in what might be the most technically demanding register in the entire cast. Squidward is the show's cynic, its self-appointed aesthete, its monument to the particular suffering of someone who is absolutely certain they deserve more than they have received, and equally certain that the world's failure to provide it is the world's fault rather than their own. He plays clarinet badly, with tremendous conviction. He paints self-portraits in enormous quantities, every one of them somehow both technically accomplished and deeply revealing of a specific inner life. He greets the perpetual, cheerful chaos of his neighbours with a combination of horror and exhaustion that is calibrated with extraordinary care to be funny without becoming mean and to invite sympathy without demanding it. The trick with Squidward, and it is a difficult trick, is that the character cannot become entirely unsympathetic. If Squidward were simply a snob, he would function as the antagonist of every episode he appeared in. But Bumpass finds something recognisable in the role, something most adults who have ever sat with the gap between who they believe themselves to be and who they actually are can see themselves in. One of the most discussed episodes from this period is the one in which Squidward, after years of performative disdain for the food he serves every day, finally allows his curiosity to override his pride and tries a Krabby Patty. The setup is simple. Squidward has always claimed to despise the food he's required to sell. He insists, above it. He is a sophisticate. He has aesthetic sensibilities that preclude appreciation of something so plebeian. But one unguarded moment, one moment when no one is watching and the possibility exists, cracks open the entire performance. He tries a bite, alone, in private, and the episode captures the specific sensory experience of tasting something extraordinary for the first time with a gleeful, almost transgressive level of detail. The production of this episode originally included a sequence set late at night in the dark, crusty crab, in which Squidward, unable to sleep and unable to stop thinking about the Krabby Patty, sneaks back in through the darkness to find another one. This sequence, in its original and more complete form, involved a series of increasingly elaborate and cartoonishly violent traps that Squidward triggers in his single-minded pursuit of what he now knows he has been missing. In certain broadcast markets, this sequence was abbreviated, and the abbreviated version still functions as a comedy, but the fuller version, which has circulated among enthusiasts of the show for many years, has a particular quality of committed darkness that feels entirely in the spirit of the era. The episode in which SpongeBob adopts a seahorse named Mystery and attempts to hide her from Mr. Krabs operates on several emotional frequencies simultaneously. On the surface, it is a comedy about a grown sponge who is comprehensively terrible at keeping a large animal secret. Beneath that, it is something warmer and stranger, a meditation on the nature of attachment and on the things we do when we love something and know somewhere underneath the love that the situation cannot continue. Mystery. The seahorse is drawn with a quiet, almost regal dignity that makes her strangely moving as a presence. She does not speak. She does not need to. The episode communicates everything important about her through the way SpongeBob looks at her, through the way he speaks to her in their private moments, through the small, tender rituals of care he builds around her presence in the days before anyone notices she is there. And the ending, in which Mystery inevitably has to leave because she belongs to the open ocean rather than to a kitchen, is handled with a restraint that is, in the context of a programme made primarily for children, quite remarkable. The show simply lets the emotion be what it is. It does not cushion it or explain it away or pivot immediately to the next joke. It sits with SpongeBob for a moment in the space the horse has left, and then gently it moves on. There is a particular kind of humour in these episodes that is genuinely difficult to describe because it operates at several speeds and layers at the same time. The most immediately perceptible layer is the physical comedy, the slapstick, the visual gags that are timed with the precision of theatrical comedy routines from a tradition that goes back much further than animation. Below that is the character comedy, which derives its energy from the very specific and very particular ways each member of the main cast misunderstands a situation or escalates a problem. And below that is something else, harder to name, a kind of ambient surrealism that lives in the background details, in the internal logic of the underwater world, in the way the show casually accepts the fundamental strangeness of its own premise, and then systematically finds new strangeness within it. The episode in which Patrick and SpongeBob conduct elaborate and apparently extraordinary adventures inside a plain cardboard box while Squidward watches from outside with baffled, increasingly desperate rage is a masterclass in this third layer of the show's humour. The joke is not ultimately that the box is magical in some literal sense. The joke is that the show commits to the bit with such complete integrity that it refuses, right to the end, to tell you which interpretation is correct. We hear the sounds from inside the box, we see the reactions on SpongeBob and Patrick's faces. We are given every reason to believe that something genuinely extraordinary is happening in that small cardboard space, and then we are denied the confirmation permanently without apology. And the episode is more interesting, more funny, and more philosophically rich for the denial than it would have been for any explanation. The creative team working on this run of episodes was a particular configuration of talent that was small enough that most of the people involved knew each other well and worked with the kind of shorthand that develops between collaborators who have spent real time in the same room solving problems together. Stephen Hillenburg maintained a strong and clearly articulated philosophy about what the show should be, and perhaps more importantly, a firm and consistently applied sense of what it should not be. He was resistant to adding backstory or heavy continuity in ways that would require a viewer to have done homework before sitting down with any given episode. He believed the show worked best when each episode was complete in itself, sealed and self-sufficient, free of the obligation to connect. This philosophy created a particular kind of freedom for the writers. Any premise, however strange, could be pursued completely, without being required to serve a larger narrative or to reconcile with something established 3 episodes ago. Each episode was its own world, and that self-containment was not a limitation, it was a liberation. The episode built around a magic conch shell in which SpongeBob, Patrick, and Sandy are accidentally launched into a forest by a catapult and find themselves lost and entirely dependent on a child's toy for decision-making guidance, is a perfect expression of this self-sufficiency in practice. Sandy, the scientist, identifies the shell almost immediately as a random response toy and not a meaningful oracle. SpongeBob and Patrick, operating from a framework that has never required proof in order to generate conviction, accept whatever the shell says as absolute and unquestionable truth. The episode builds with patience and with beautiful comic timing toward a moment where the shell's random answers turn out to be, through sheer and spectacular cosmic accident, entirely correct. It is a comment delivered very lightly and with enormous humour on the relationship between faith and evidence, on the question of what it means for something to work, regardless of the mechanism by which it works. Bill Fagerbakker, who gives voice to Patrick Star, is performing one of the most philosophically interesting characters in American animation, though the show would be the last to make anything so grand a claim about him, and would in fact probably find the claim slightly suspicious. Patrick is profoundly and comprehensively stupid. He sleeps under a rock. He forgets things with a speed that suggests the information never quite made it to storage in the first place. He misunderstands instructions at a molecular level. He has, on multiple occasions, been surprised by his own hands, and yet there is something about the character that resists the category of mere comic incompetent, because the stupidity is not mean-spirited, and it is not presented as pathology. It is simply Patrick. Patrick is happy. Patrick is, in many ways and by most available measures, the happiest character in the entire show. His complete and apparently effortless indifference to the things the world uses to evaluate a life, achievement, status, consistency, the capacity to remember what you were doing 5 minutes ago, has left him in a state of accidental and apparently indestructible contentment that the supposedly smarter characters around him perpetually fail to manufacture for themselves. Fagerbakker plays every moment with a warmth and a slightly dazed goodwill that never once tips into condescension, and that is exactly why the character works. The episode in which Mrs. Puff ends up in prison and experiences something approaching liberation is one of the darker comedies in this stretch of episodes, and it earns its darkness precisely because the show has spent enough time building the character that the darkness is grounded in something real. Mrs. Puff is SpongeBob's boating instructor. This fact has been one of the show's foundational and most patiently sustained jokes since the very beginning, because SpongeBob is enthusiastic, dedicated, technically attentive, and completely and catastrophically terrible at actual driving, and Mrs. Puff bears the consequences of each failure in the most immediate and physical way possible, because the show's logic dictates that a frightened pufferfish inflates, and Mrs. Puff, when SpongeBob drives, is almost always frightened. The episode in which he goes to prison emerges from a question the show had never quite asked directly. What would happen if Mrs. Puff, for once, was somewhere SpongeBob was not? The answer, it turns out, is that she would be fine. She would be considerably more than fine. She would discover, in the routine of prison life, a predictability and a freedom from a specific kind of terror that her actual job denies her. And the episode handles this with more gentleness than the premise might suggest, finding in it something true about the way the presence of certain people in our lives can constitute, entirely, without malice, its own specific kind of captivity. Mary Jo Catlett, who voices Mrs. Puff, brings to the character a quality that is surprisingly hard to put into words. Mrs. Puff is a figure of chronic stress and low-grade ongoing horror. She has been inflated, deflated, hospitalized, arrested, and systematically psychologically destabilized by the relentless optimism of her worst student, and she faces each new day with the expression of someone who knows what is waiting and has been unable to find an exit from the loop. And yet Catlett plays her with a specific kind of dignity that resists the easy choice of making her simply a target. There is a real person in there. The performance keeps insisting, beneath all the suffering, someone who wanted something from life, who had plans and preferences and a sense of herself as a professional, and who has not entirely given up, even now, even in the depths of the most recent disaster. One of the episodes most frequently discussed in the context of the show's technical and conceptual ambition during this period is the one structured entirely as a corporate training video for new Krusty Krab employees. The episode commits to its framing device with absolute completeness. There is a narrator who speaks in the precisely calibrated register of institutional corporate media, the slightly too smooth, slightly too authoritative voice of someone who has been paid to sound genuinely enthusiastic about fry cooking procedures. The aesthetic is familiar to anyone who has been made to watch that particular genre of workplace communication. The slightly dated visual quality, the sincere treatment of entirely mundane information, as though it were both fascinating and vitally important. The sense of an institution taking itself with perfect seriousness in matters that deserve none. The episode does not break the framing for comedy. It uses the framing as the comedy. SpongeBob appears in it described entirely through the language of corporate evaluation, which renders him simultaneously more explicable and less explicable than he is in his natural state. And threaded through the entire documentary structure is a running joke about the Krabby Patty secret formula, which the episode approaches and describes and circles, and ultimately, definitively, completely fails to reveal. It is one of the most satisfying non-revelations in a show that has made the sustained non-revelation of one specific piece of information into an art form. The music of the show across this period is something that deserves considerably more attention than it typically receives, which is remarkable given how central it is to the emotional texture of every single episode. The score was assembled through a combination of original compositions and an extraordinarily deep library of production music, much of it originally recorded decades earlier for entirely unrelated purposes: nautical documentary footage, variety programming, advertising reels for products that no longer exist. The music supervisors and composers working on the show had an ear for the way these pieces could be repurposed and recontextualized, for the way a particular piece of Hawaiian slide guitar could carry an establishing shot of Goo Lagoon into something that felt simultaneously cheerful and faintly dreamlike, or the way a specific bass line could transform a completely ordinary moment into something just slightly menacing without anyone being able to say exactly why. There is a particular piece of ukulele music that plays frequently during quiet establishing shots of Bikini Bottom, drifting over wide views of the town before the action of an episode begins. This piece exists now primarily as a kind of emotional shorthand in the cultural memory of an entire generation. It triggers something specific and hard to name, not quite nostalgia, because nostalgia implies the thing is gone, and this particular feeling suggests more permanence than that. It is the feeling of a specific quality of late afternoon, of a world that has not yet acquired the weight and complication it will later acquire, of warmth that is still present and not yet being mourned. The fact that this feeling can be reliably triggered by a piece of production music composed for a television program about an anthropomorphic sea sponge says something genuinely interesting about the relationship between sound and memory, about the way certain experiences in early life write themselves into the nervous system at a depth that cannot be fully anticipated by the people creating them. The snowball episode is, on its surface, a very simple premise executed with great confidence. SpongeBob and Patrick build an elaborate snowball fort in the yard. Squidward, disdaining the entire enterprise from the warmth of his home, refuses to participate. And then, with the inevitability of physics, circumstances draw Squidward into the conflict in a way that circumvents both his disdain and his dignity. The episode is exactly what it needs to be, and nothing more. But the execution is sufficiently assured and the performances are sufficiently precise that it becomes, somehow, more than the sum of its parts. There is a moment in the episode where Squidward, struck by a snowball, stands completely still for just a beat longer than you expect, simply experiencing the indignity of what has just occurred before responding to it, and the timing of that beat is the kind of thing that only happens when everyone involved in making a piece of comedy understands the material at a level that has gone past technique and into instinct. The episode in which Mr. Krabs sells SpongeBob a novelty soda drinking hat for a trivially small amount of money and then discovers, too late, that the hat is a rare and extraordinarily valuable collectible is a masterpiece of escalating commitment to a premise. Krabs sells something cheaply, realizes he should not have, and must spend the episode attempting to recover it. This is a simple structure, but the episode takes it to genuinely spectacular places, because the hat eventually ends up in a graveyard, in the custody of a ghost who is disinclined to negotiate, and Mr. Krabs, propelled by the sheer locomotive force of his own greed, goes to war with the supernatural without apparent hesitation or significant concern for the implications. The episode has the quality of a folk tale, of a story in which someone wants something so badly that the wanting becomes its own kind of odyssey, and the ending, which involves a skeletal army and a revelation about the hat's true value, arrives with the confidence of a story that is fully committed to its own strangeness. The production of an animated television show at this period operated according to timelines that are, by the standards of most creative industries, almost incomprehensibly compressed. A single episode, from initial concept to final delivered product, might move through the pipeline over 6 to 12 months, depending on the specific demands of the episode and the current state of every other episode in various stages of simultaneous completion. Scripts being drafted and revised, storyboards being drawn and reviewed, animatics being cut and evaluated, animation being produced at overseas studios and then reviewed and corrected and refined, audio being recorded and mixed and matched to picture. The people working on a show at this scale are always managing multiple moving parts simultaneously, always making decisions whose consequences will not be visible for months, always trusting that the judgment calls made under production pressure will hold up when they can finally see the finished thing. The fact that, operating under these conditions, a creative team can sustain the consistency of tone and vision and quality that defines this stretch of episodes is, when you actually think about it, genuinely extraordinary. The episode in which SpongeBob has a physical accident while sandboarding and subsequently refuses to leave his house is one of the show's more direct engagements with anxiety as a subject, though it approaches the subject with a lightness that keeps it from feeling like instruction. SpongeBob's fear, once established, is absurd in the way that the show requires things to be absurd, but the absurdity is sympathetic. We understand from the inside how the fear makes complete sense to SpongeBob, even as we can see clearly from the outside that it does not correspond to the actual level of danger he faces. The resolution, which involves a gorilla and a departure from the episode's established reality, so decisive that it momentarily reorients the viewer's sense of what kind of story they are watching, is a piece of pure comedy logic that somehow also functions as an emotional solution. The fear breaks not because SpongeBob reasons his way out of it, but because the arrival of something so much more impossible makes the original fear seem, by comparison, manageable. The episode in which SpongeBob and Patrick obtain invisible spray and use it to prank their neighbours before the situation spirals entirely beyond their control is one of the show's most structurally elegant comedies. The premise is clean and the execution is nimble, and the real pleasure of the episode lies in watching two characters who are constitutionally incapable of maintaining deception try very hard to maintain deception, with every attempt at concealment generating new problems that require new and more elaborate concealment to address. SpongeBob's inability to lie is one of his most endearing qualities and one of the most reliable sources of comedic energy throughout the entire run of the series. He does not have the architecture for sustained dishonesty. He lacks the internal wiring, and watching him attempt to hold a lie together while every instinct he possesses rebels against the attempt is the kind of comedy that works because it is grounded entirely in character rather than merely in situation. The episode involving the health inspector is one of the show's more baroque structural comedies, built on an increasingly elaborate and nested web of misunderstanding that the episode peels back with the patience and precision of a particularly skilled layer-by-layer reveal. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs, convinced that they have accidentally caused the food inspector's death through a contaminated patty, spend the episode attempting to manage the consequences of something that did not actually happen, while the inspector, not dead in the slightest, pursues an entirely separate agenda of his own that the episode withholds until the moment when its revelation reframes everything that came before. The structural elegance of the episode, its willingness to hold multiple levels of misunderstanding in the air simultaneously and resolve them in sequence, is impressive for a program working in short self-contained episodes, and reflects a writing team that had fully internalized the mechanics of the form they were working in. There is a character who appears in one episode of this period, a large flounder named Flats, voiced by Thomas F. Wilson, an actor whose name is inseparable from one of the great screen antagonists of the 1980s. Flats has a singular and unwavering purpose, which is that he has decided, for reasons the episode declines to fully explain, and that the comedy does not require, to kick SpongeBob's butt. This threat hangs over the episode with a specific quality of dread that the show manages to make genuinely funny by refusing to take it lightly. SpongeBob treats the threat with the earnest terror a reasonable person might bring to a genuine danger. He attempts to reason with Flats. He attempts to preemptively build a friendship that would preclude the conflict. He attempts to explain why the situation is unnecessarily adversarial and that alternatives are available. Flats is unmoved by all of this, and the episode builds to a resolution that is so perfectly, completely, unexpectedly right that it became one of the most remembered episode endings in the entire run of the series. The prehistoric special is a departure from the show's normal format that works precisely because it takes the departure completely seriously. The episode imagines prehistoric versions of the main cast living in a world that has the same emotional and social logic as Bikini Bottom, but none of its conveniences, and the performers, freed from the usual settings and props, find new angles on characters that have already been deeply established. Prehistoric SpongeBob has the same fundamental optimism as his modern counterpart, but expressed through the specific context of a world in which fire has only recently been invented and the concept of cooking is still purely theoretical. Prehistoric Patrick has the same fundamental approach to reality that characterizes his modern self and is, consequently, equally unsuited to navigating whatever situation he finds himself in. The episode is framed by Patchy the Pirate, a live-action character played by Tom Kenny, and the segments involving Patchy have their own energy and rhythm that function as a kind of affectionate frame around the animated material. One of the quieter creative decisions that shapes the emotional experience of these episodes, and of the show as a whole during this period, is the relationship between the storytelling and the specific physical geography of Bikini Bottom. The town is not simply a backdrop against which things happen. It has a personality, a specific physical logic, a set of locations that carry their own histories and their own emotional associations for the viewer. Goo Lagoon is the beach, the place of summer and leisure, and the specific kind of physical comedy that emerges when characters are in swimwear and the stakes are artificially low. The Krusty Krab is the economic and social centre of the world, the place where most things happen and most people pass through, the engine around which the whole town orbits. Squidward's Easter Island head home is the show's monument to a specific kind of disappointed aspiration, standing between SpongeBob's pineapple and Patrick's rock with the dignity of a structure that was designed to impress and has ended up serving a function nobody planned. Rock Bottom is the place beyond the normal world, the deep and the strange, the location you reach when you have gone too far in the wrong direction and are not entirely sure whether the way back still exists. And Jellyfish Fields is the wild place, the open space, the location that represents freedom and play and the specific quality of an afternoon that belongs entirely to itself. The relationship between SpongeBob and Squidward is, when you stop to look at it directly, one of the most interesting dynamics in the entire show, and one of the most genuinely strange. SpongeBob loves Squidward. This is not complicated or ambivalent. It is simply and completely true. SpongeBob loves his neighbour in the uncomplicated, total way that the show presents as both genuinely wonderful and, from Squidward's perspective, genuinely overwhelming. Squidward's problem is not that SpongeBob is malicious. Squidward's problem is that SpongeBob is sincere. The love is real, and it is constant, and it is entirely indifferent to Squidward's response to it. Because the love does not require reciprocation in order to persist. It simply continues. It is always there. It will always be there. And living adjacent to something that loves you, that purely, when you are someone who has invested considerable identity in the performance of not needing love, is its own very specific and very particular form of suffering. The Squilliam episode, in which Squidward pretends to own a 5-star restaurant in order to impress the rival who has always succeeded where Squidward has always fallen just short, is one of the most psychologically precise expressions of Squidward's inner life that the run produces. Squilliam Fancyson is everything Squidward has always believed he was meant to be. He is wealthy, he is celebrated, he has achieved the artistic success and the public recognition that Squidward has spent years telling himself is owed to him, and has simply, through some cosmic administrative error, not yet been delivered. And Squilliam is not cruel. This is the difficult and important thing about him. He does not perform his success. He simply has it, And it is real, and that is so much worse for Squidward than any cruelty could be. The episode hinges on Squidward recruiting the entire Krusty Krab staff to help him maintain the illusion of his fictional five-star establishment, and most of the comedy comes from the escalating gap between the story Squidward is telling and the reality attempting to persist beneath it. But the heart of the episode is in Squidward's face throughout, in the specific and quite beautiful agony of someone who has always suspected they might not be who they thought they were, and is now having that suspicion confirmed in real time in front of the one person whose good opinion they most desperately wanted. The robot episode, in which SpongeBob becomes convinced that Mr. Krabs has been replaced by a robot, is a particularly good example of the show's capacity for maintaining an absurd premise with complete internal consistency. SpongeBob has misinterpreted a set of entirely ordinary observations and constructed from them an entirely wrong but entirely internally consistent theory, and then proceeds to act on that theory with the same determination and sincerity he brings to everything. The episode is a comedy of escalating misdirection, in which the wrong premise generates increasingly elaborate responses that are correct responses to the wrong premise, and the humour comes entirely from watching a character be comprehensively right about everything except the foundational question. Mr. Krabs, confronted with SpongeBob's investigation, responds with the baffled defensiveness of someone being accused of something that makes no sense, which of course looks, from within SpongeBob's framework, like exactly what a robot would do. The Rockabye Bivalve episode, in which SpongeBob and Patrick find an orphaned baby scallop and decide together to raise it, is one of the episodes most frequently discussed in the context of what the show was willing to engage with thematically during this period. The episode runs on a premise organised around domestic partnership, with SpongeBob taking on the caregiving role at home and Patrick going to work each day. And the episode is genuinely and clearly about what this arrangement entails, about the specific friction that develops when one partner's work is continuous and exhausting and invisible, and the other partner's work is intermittent and outside the house, and therefore easier to point to as evidence of contribution. Patrick, asked what he did at work all day, produces answers that are self-evidently not work-related. SpongeBob, managing the baby and the house and the thousand small daily logistics of keeping things together, feels the specific frustration of effort that is not seen. The episode treats these as real grievances. They are played through comedy, but they are real, and the resolution involves something that actual resolution involves, which is a moment of mutual recognition rather than simply a capitulation. The episode in which Mr. Krabs hosts a fishing trip, supposedly in celebration, and things spiral dramatically due to a giant clam and a lost dollar, is in many ways a love letter to the 1975 film Jaws, and it is a love letter that the episode sends with great affection and considerable technical skill. The working title for the episode, internally, was Sponge Jaws, a designation that production materials and model sheets from that period still carry, though Nickelodeon eventually settled on the less pointed and more legally cautious final title. Nearly every element of the classic film structure finds its counterpart in the episode. 3 figures on a boat, obsession with a creature, the gradual dissolution of reason under the pressure of that obsession, the musical cues that evoke the original score without reproducing it. Mr. Krabs occupies the role of the obsessed captain driven toward irrationality by his need to recover what was taken from him. SpongeBob functions in the role of the sensible one, trying to anchor the situation in reality. Squidward is present as the skeptic who knows this is a bad idea and cannot find a way out of participating in it. And the episode also carries within it an additional reference to the novel about the great white whale, because the lost dollar is, in miniature, exactly what the whale is in that story. the thing that a person cannot stop wanting, even when the wanting has ceased to have any sensible relationship to the cost. There is a production detail worth dwelling on, which is the relationship between the storyboard process during this period and the final animated product. The storyboards from this era, several of which have been shared publicly by artists who worked on the show in the years since, reveal an extraordinary level of specificity about moments that might look, in the final episode, as though they happened spontaneously. Notes on character reactions in these boards describe not just the physical pose, but the specific emotional register the pose is meant to carry. The exact flavour of discomfort, or surprise, or controlled panic. The precise degree to which an eyebrow rises relative to the situation's stakes. The notes describe the difference between confusion and bewilderment, between disappointment and devastation, between a character who is about to speak and a character who has decided not to. The level of craft in the boards reflects a creative team that had developed a precise and shared vocabulary for the show's visual language and trusted the animation studios working from those boards to honour it. The camping episode, in which SpongeBob and Patrick set up camp in the yard directly outside their homes, and Squidward, with every intention of remaining entirely uninvolved, is gradually and inevitably drawn into the misadventure anyway, is a masterclass in rule-based comedy. The episode establishes, early and with great specificity, a set of behavioural rules relating to the sea bear, a creature of apparently legendary ferocity. These rules are specific, arbitrary, and delivered with total conviction. Wearing a houndstooth pattern will attract a sea bear. Eating soup loudly will attract a sea bear. Playing the clarinet badly will attract a sea bear. Running, walking, limping, and crawling, presented in that order as escalating failures of the same strategy, will all attract a sea bear. Once the rules are established, the episode proceeds to find every possible way they can be invoked, misunderstood, and catastrophically misapplied, and the comedy is cumulative. Each new invocation of the rule builds on the previous ones. By the time the sea rhinoceros is introduced as an additional variable, the episode has created a world with such complete and committed internal logic that the addition of a second impossible animal with its own arbitrary rules feels like a natural and even inevitable escalation. The episode in which Mr. Krabs temporarily becomes generous is unusual in this run for the specific way it handles the restoration of Mr. Krabs' fundamental character at the end. The premise follows Krabs after a brush with circumstances that convince him he has made a bargain regarding his life, and in the aftermath he becomes genuinely, completely, almost disturbingly generous. He gives things away. He smiles with an openness that unsettles everyone who knows him. He embodies generosity so completely for a brief window of screen time that the other characters visibly do not know how to respond to him, because this version of Mr. Krabs does not correspond to anything in their experience of who he is. And then the money enters the picture again, and the greed reasserts itself with the completeness of something returning to its natural state, and Mr. Krabs is restored, and the episode ends in a way that is comedically satisfying, and if you are willing to sit with it past the laugh, genuinely a little sad. Because the generous version of Mr. Krabs was real. Even briefly, it existed and it could not survive. The Great Snail Race episode is notable for the particular way it handles SpongeBob and Gary's relationship in a different emotional register than usual. Gary the snail is, in most episodes, a background presence, a domestic fixture, a pet who occasionally reveals surprising depth or unexpected competence, but who mostly functions as texture in SpongeBob's home life. The racing episode gives Gary a story, filtered through the pressure of SpongeBob's competitive investment in Gary's performance. SpongeBob wants Gary to win. He trains him intensively. He pushes him beyond what Gary is comfortable with, and Gary, being a snail with the emotional life of a creature who is being asked to perform for someone else's satisfaction rather than his own, eventually communicates his objection in the only way available to him. The episode handles this simply and without heavy sentiment, but it lands in a real place, and it says something true about the gap between what we want for the things we love and what those things actually need from us. The midlife crisis episode follows Mr. Krabs through a specific and recognizable experience, the sense of age as a theft of something that cannot quite be named, the longing for a quality of experience rather than any specific lost thing. Mr. Krabs attempts to recapture something he cannot articulate, and he enlists SpongeBob and Patrick as guides through a version of youth, which goes exactly as you would expect it to go. The episode is a comedy, as it must be, but beneath the comedy there is something honest about the specific texture of a particular kind of nostalgia, the longing not for a time or a place, but for an openness to experience, a quality of being in the world before the world became what it became that cannot be recovered by doing any specific thing that was done during the original time, because the thing that made those experiences what they were was not the activities, but the person having them. The chocolate episode has become, in the years since it aired, one of the most quoted and referenced episodes in the show's entire history, and it has earned that status. SpongeBob and Patrick decide to become entrepreneurs after encountering Squidward's copy of a magazine for the wealthy and concluding immediately and with full conviction that they too would like to live this way. Their enterprise is the door-to-door sale of chocolate bars. And from this simple premise, the episode generates a series of encounters that build into something almost mythological in their accumulation. Each door that opens reveals a different character with a different relationship to what is being offered. The man who screams chocolate, whose reaction escalates through the whole episode in ways that begin as frightening and arrive, in the episode's final moments, somewhere completely unexpected. The woman and her impossibly ancient mother, a two-person comedic universe with its own rhythms and its own very specific preoccupations. The con artists who sell SpongeBob and Patrick overpriced marketing advice, and then, in a perfectly timed reversal, become customers. Each encounter is complete in itself and has its own logic and its own internal rhythm. And the episode as a whole has the quality of a great piece of music, a theme introduced, developed, varied, and brought home. The Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes from this period continue the show's longest-running secondary plot, which is the relationship between two elderly retired superheroes living in an assisted care facility and their extraordinarily enthusiastic young neighbour. Ernest Borgnine, who voiced Mermaid Man, was an actor of enormous experience and a voice performer of genuine craft, and the specific quality he brought to the character, a combination of aged heroism and gentle ongoing confusion about his surroundings, is exactly the quality the episodes need. Tim Conway, who voiced Barnacle Boy, played the role with a weariness that was its own sustained comedy, the specific weariness of a person who has been dealing with a particular situation for a very long time and has arrived at a relationship with it that is not quite acceptance, but is also no longer active resistance. The dynamic between the two characters, one of whom has lost track of quite a lot, and one of whom has lost track of nothing and does not know what to do with that, is one of the show's warmest and most carefully maintained running elements. In one of these episodes, SpongeBob gets his hands on a device that allows him to resize objects, and in a chain of events that he did not intend, ends up shrinking most of Bikini Bottom's population to miniature size. The episode is primarily a comedy of consequence, of someone who meant well making things significantly worse, and the comedy is efficient and very funny. But the episode is also interesting for the way it handles SpongeBob's response to the consequences of his own mistake, which is not denial or deflection, but something more characteristic of him, a kind of horrified earnestness, a complete willingness to acknowledge what happened combined with a slightly less complete capacity to fix it. The episode in which Squidward pretends to be a gourmet restaurant owner to impress a snobbish old rival draws on a very precise and very real psychological phenomenon. The phenomenon of someone who has spent a long time believing they are more than their circumstances reflect, finally being forced to choose between maintaining the belief and accepting the reality. Squidward chooses the belief, recruits an improvised staff, and spends the episode managing an escalating gap between the story he is telling and the reality underneath it. The funny version of this is the episode. The not funny version of this is a thing that happens to real people constantly, and the show understands both registers simultaneously and finds a way to honour both without making the episode something other than a comedy. The episode titled Party Pooper Pants, in which SpongeBob plans a neighbourhood party with the meticulous detail of someone who genuinely believes that optimal scheduling and the right activities will produce a certain quality of joy, and then gets locked out of his own house and spends the entire party pressed against the outside of the window. Watching his careful plans proceed without him is one of those episodes that works as pure comedy and also, simultaneously, as something slightly philosophical about the nature of control and its limits. SpongeBob's plans are detailed and sincere and full of the specific optimism that characterizes everything he does. And then a door closes and the party continues, evidently successfully, entirely without him. The thing he built does not need him in the way he assumed it would, and SpongeBob, outside the window, must find a relationship with that fact. The episode in which Squidward attempts to get SpongeBob to stop being SpongeBob by returning to the new student environment of boating school, taking Patrick along as a classmate, is notable for the specific dynamic it creates between SpongeBob and Patrick in a context outside their usual one. Patrick in a school environment is Patrick dealing with a set of institutional expectations that are essentially orthogonal to everything Patrick understands about how situations work, and the episode mines this with a patience and a generosity toward both characters that keeps the comedy from becoming condescending. SpongeBob, trying to be a good student and a good friend simultaneously, discovers that these two goals are not always compatible, and the episode follows this discovery with more honesty than the premise might suggest. The episode in which SpongeBob witnesses a crime becomes involved in the subsequent legal process and ends up being pursued by the very criminal he helped to apprehend is an episode built on escalation, so committed and so complete that it arrives at a kind of sublime absurdity, where the comedy and the narrative logic are fully aligned and mutually reinforcing. SpongeBob, as a witness, simply told the truth, and the truth set a process in motion that he did not fully anticipate. The episode is, in this respect, a very small story about the gap between the act and the consequence, about the way doing the right thing does not guarantee anything pleasant about what comes next, and about SpongeBob's particular quality of remaining identifiably himself through situations that would destabilize almost anyone else. There is something in the body of work produced during this period that speaks to a specific ambition about what animated television for children could be and do. The best episodes are not condescending. They do not simplify their emotional material to the point of rendering it safe. They engage with real questions about identity and belonging and fear and ambition and the gap between what we want and what we have and what we are capable of becoming. And they engage with those questions through comedy, through absurdism, through the specific freedoms of a medium that is not required to obey the physical laws of the world it represents. And the result is something that worked for children when it was made and continues to work for those same people as adults, because the questions it was asking were real questions and the feelings it was engaging with were real feelings, even when the vehicles for engaging with them were a sponge and a starfish and a dissatisfied squid living under the ocean. The episode in which SpongeBob becomes convinced he is a television celebrity and begins conducting himself accordingly is a meditation on self-perception and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we deserve. SpongeBob sees himself on a television advertisement for the Krusty Krab for approximately 3 seconds and concludes immediately and with total conviction that he is now a recognized public figure. He signs autographs for people who do not know who he is. He assumes that every look directed at him is a look of recognition. He develops in miniature the specific cognitive distortions that accompany a certain kind of fame, or the sincere belief in a certain kind of fame. And the show observes this without mockery. SpongeBob is not being satirized. He is being SpongeBob, which means he is being completely sincere about something that is, from the outside, completely without basis. And the comedy and the tenderness of the episode come from holding both of those things in view at the same time. In the episode in which Squidward quits his job, and eventually, through a sequence of misfortunes and a specific quality of SpongeBob's hospitality, ends up living with SpongeBob for an extended period, the show tracks a long arc with more patience than the short episode format usually allows. Squidward moves in. Squidward becomes comfortable. Squidward becomes so comfortable that the comfort itself becomes a trap, because comfort can do that. SpongeBob, who is initially delighted to have his neighbour in his home, discovers that there is a specific quality of presence that is too much even for someone whose baseline tolerance for presence is extraordinarily high. The episode ends in restoration, both characters returning to where they belong, but the journey there is handled with more psychological honesty than the premise suggests, finding something true in both Squidward's helplessness and SpongeBob's eventual need for a boundary. Late in this particular run of episodes, there is an episode about clams, specifically about a giant clam that swallows Mr. Krabs' most prized possession, his millionth dollar, and the increasingly irrational campaign to recover it. The episode was, internally, for a significant portion of its development, called Sponge Jaws, and that working title communicates clearly the primary reference the episode is engaging with, which is the 1975 Steven Spielberg film about a great white shark and the 3 men who go to hunt it. The parallels are comprehensive. 3 men on a boat, obsession with a creature, a captain driven to the edge of reason by his need to recover what the creature took. Music that evokes without reproducing the original score. And woven into all of this is a secondary reference to the great American novel about a white whale. Because the lost dollar is, in the economy of Mr. Krabs' psychology, precisely what the whale is in that story. The thing that cannot be let go, even when letting go, is clearly the rational choice. The thing that says more about the person pursuing it than it does about itself. The show during this period also made a habit, in quieter and less obvious ways, of treating the background population of Bikini Bottom as a real community rather than a random collection of incidental characters. The same figures appear across multiple episodes, in different contexts, without the show ever making a formal announcement of their presence. They are simply there, as the residents of a real place are simply there, living their lives alongside the main story, occupying the same world. This quality of background consistency, of a world that continues to exist even when the camera is not looking at it, is one of the things that gives Bikini Bottom the specific feeling of reality it has, the sense that it is a place rather than a set. As this particular stretch of episodes draws toward its close, it does so in the spirit of mischief that has characterized much of what came before. SpongeBob and Patrick, invisible and emboldened, push their pranks past the point of prudence and arrive at consequences more spectacular and more supernatural than anything they had planned for. The episode ends in fire, in screaming, in a level of surrealism deployed with the complete confidence of a show that knows exactly how strange it is, willing to be, and has never been embarrassed about the answer. And then Bikini Bottom returns to quiet. The lights go down. The pineapple glows in the undersea dark. The characters settle back into themselves and into the rhythms of the world the show has built for them, the world that will continue to exist, unchanged and unhurried, whenever anyone wants to return to it. Stephen Hillenburg left as showrunner, following this period to focus on the feature film he had been developing as a planned conclusion to the series he had created. The film was, in his intention, the end of the story. The characters would go out on a high note. The world would be complete, and then the world would be returned to the people who had loved it, to carry with them into whatever came next. Things did not go exactly according to this plan, as things in the creative industries rarely do. But the body of work from this period stands as its own complete thing regardless, as a document of what happens when talented people love what they're making and are given the time and the resources to make it well and the freedom to follow their instincts about what the work needs. What is left when you sit with these episodes for a while is something that the medium of animation does not always manage to produce, despite having unique capacities to do so. It is a sense of a world that is fully realised, that has its own logic and its own warmth, that exists as more than the sum of its plots and characters and backgrounds and music cues. Bikini Bottom is a real place in the sense that the places that matter to us are real, which is to say it exists in the specific regions of memory and feeling where the things that shaped us live. The characters are real in the sense that people who have taught us something about ourselves are real, which is to say they occupy a kind of permanent residency in the imagination that has nothing to do with their ontological status as drawings. Let the rest go for now, the things that felt urgent earlier today, the things that will feel urgent again tomorrow. Right now, there is just this, just the quiet, just the warm, amber light of a world beneath the ocean that was built from attention and from love and from the patient cultivation of something small and strange and entirely worth making. The pineapple is still glowing. Gary is asleep. Patrick is under his rock. Sandy has turned off the lights in her dome. Squidward is alone in his house, which is how he prefers it, except for the moments when he would prefer otherwise, which are more frequent than he would ever say out loud. Sleep well, and if tonight was somewhere you'd like to return to, we'll be here. There is something worth saying about the specific way the show handles physical comedy during this period, because the approach is more considered than it might initially appear. Physical comedy in animation carries a particular freedom that live-action comedy does not have. Gravity is optional. Proportion is optional. The rules of what a body can do and how it can recover from being done to are entirely at the discretion of the people drawing it. And the show, during this era, used those freedoms with a kind of disciplined joy that is very specific to this run. The physical gags are not random. They are calibrated. They know exactly how far to push the visual logic before the image becomes something other than funny. And they stop at precisely the right moment, or occasionally, with enormous deliberateness and precision, go one step further than that. The sea bear attacks in the camping episode are a perfect example of this calibration in practice. Each attack is violent in a very specific and completely harmless way, a way that reads as consequence without reading as cruelty, and the escalation of the attacks follows a rhythm that is as carefully structured as a piece of music. The way the show handles Squidward's relationship with his own art is one of its most sustained and most quietly rich ongoing jokes. Squidward makes art. He makes a great deal of it. He paints self-portraits in enormous quantity and with considerable technical accomplishment, and he regards each finished work with the satisfaction of someone who does not doubt for a moment that what he has made is important. The episodes never actually confirm or deny whether Squidward's art is good. The show presents it through other characters' reactions and through the gap between Squidward's conviction and everyone else's response, and it leaves the question genuinely open in a way that is both funnier and more respectful than a simple answer would be. Because the question of whether Squidward's art is good is not really the point. The point is that Squidward makes it, and that making it matters to him, and that this mattering is real regardless of its reception, and that the show understands the difference between a person's relationship with their own creative work and that work's objective quality. One of the most distinctive things about the animated characters in these episodes is the degree to which their character is communicated through their physical design rather than simply through their dialogue or their actions. SpongeBob is a rectangle with rounded corners, which communicates softness and approachability. His large eyes are set wide and high on his face, giving him an expression of permanent, open surprise. His mouth occupies an unusually large proportion of his face, because expression is central to who he is, because the face is where his enthusiasm lives. These design choices were made carefully and with full awareness of what they communicated, and they communicate the same things in every single scene without requiring any additional work from the animation. You know who SpongeBob is before he opens his mouth, from the shape of him, from the way his proportions arrange themselves into an expression of fundamental warmth. Squidward, by contrast, is designed around length and vertical tension. He is tall and narrow, with a nose that extends so far from his face that it arrives at destinations before the rest of him, and with eyes that sit in a permanent expression that is not quite contempt but is adjacent to it. The design communicates aspiration and disappointment simultaneously. The combination of someone who holds themselves high and regularly finds the world below them anyway. Patrick is round and low, designed for maximum stability and minimum urgency, and his face, when it is not in the middle of registering something, settles into an expression of benign, untroubled vacancy that is the design's most honest communication about who he is. The episodes from this period also demonstrate a particular willingness to take ordinary moments seriously, to let scenes breathe and develop at their own pace, rather than rushing toward the next plot point or the next joke. There are moments in these episodes that are simply quiet, that allow a character to exist in a space for a moment without anything being required of them. And these quiet moments are part of what gives the episodes their specific emotional weight. The show trusts its audience to be patient, to sit with a character, rather than needing to be constantly entertained by what that character is doing. And that trust is part of what makes the episodes feel substantial, in a way that faster, more relentlessly active animation does not. The relationship between SpongeBob and Gary deserves more sustained attention than it typically receives, partly because it is one of the show's most consistent emotional threads, and partly because it is handled with a subtlety that is easy to overlook. Gary is SpongeBob's pet snail, and the show never forgets this, and never lets you forget it. But Gary is also, within the logic of the show's world, clearly an intelligent and emotionally present being who has opinions and preferences and a life that is not entirely defined by his relationship to SpongeBob. The episodes that focus on Gary's perspective, or that give Gary scenes that occur outside SpongeBob's awareness, reveal a character with a kind of quiet, patient wisdom that makes sense for a creature who has watched the same person do the same things for a very long time and has arrived at a kind of serene acceptance of the fact. The episode in which SpongeBob volunteers as a lifeguard at Goo Lagoon, despite not being able to swim in the way that the job requires, is a comedy of impostorship and escalating commitment to a false front that has direct emotional connections to several other episodes and to SpongeBob's character broadly. SpongeBob cannot admit the thing he cannot do because the admission is too much for his particular brand of self-regard to accommodate. He has built an identity around competence, around being the person who does his job well and takes pride in doing it well, and the revelation that he is not competent in this specific context is a threat to that identity that he cannot face directly. The episode is funny, very consistently, and sometimes brilliantly so, but it also says something true about the relationship between identity an admission about the way a certain kind of pride can make you less, rather than more capable of dealing with the situation honestly. The episode in which Patrick is enrolled in boating school alongside SpongeBob generates a particular dynamic that the show explores with some care. SpongeBob, who has spent years in the environment of boating school in the specific role of the perpetual student who cannot pass, suddenly has a peer, someone to compare himself to and to be compared to. Patrick, who has no relationship whatsoever to the academic experience being offered, brings to the classroom a quality of radical indifference to institutional evaluation that is both comedically spectacular and, in a quiet way, slightly illuminating. Patrick is not intimidated by the prospect of failure because Patrick has never organised his experience around the fear of it. He does not know what a bad grade means to identity. He simply exists, and the class exists, and the two do not have a particularly fraught relationship. And SpongeBob, watching this, feels something that the episode does not name, but that the audience recognises. The show's relationship to the Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy mythology is one of its most affectionate, sustained inventions. The idea that the underwater world would have its own superhero tradition, its own legacy of costumed crime fighters who have grown old and who are now living out their retirement in ways that do not quite match the legends built around them, is genuinely original and genuinely funny. And the episodes build that mythology with patience, adding layers over multiple outings without ever making any single episode dependent on having seen the previous ones. You can watch any of the Mermaid Man episodes as a standalone piece and understand everything you need to understand. But if you have been watching all along, the accumulated history adds a resonance that deepens every new episode. Ernest Borgnine and Tim Conway, who voiced Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy respectively, were performers with careers stretching back to the golden era of American film and television, and the knowledge they brought to the recordings, the instincts of performers who had spent decades in front of audiences and cameras, is audible in every line. Borgnine's Mermaid Man has a specific quality of heroic dignity that has become slightly unfocused with age, and Borgnine plays the dignity straight while allowing the unfocused quality to do the comedy. Conway's Barnacle Boy plays everything with a precision and a sense of timing that was a signature of his long comedic career, and the weariness he brings to the character is the weariness of someone who has made a specific kind of peace with the specific absurdity of his situation. A peace that is not quite happy, but is also not unhappy. That is simply the equilibrium of someone who has been here long enough to know that the situation is not going to change. The episode in which SpongeBob struggles with being the cooking performer that Mr. Krabs has decided to make him, and ultimately solves his stage fright by creating a puppet alter ego named Chef Bob to perform in his place, is interesting for a reason the episode itself does not explicitly engage with. SpongeBob, across the full run of the series, is not someone who struggles with performance. He has performed in numerous contexts, in large crowds and small ones, for audiences who wanted him to be there, and audiences who very much did not. The stage fright in this episode represents, if you're paying attention, a specific kind of inconsistency with the character's established nature. And it is worth noting because it reflects something about how the show's character knowledge can occasionally be unevenly distributed across different writing teams working on different episodes. The episode is funny, the puppet is a wonderful invention, but the premise rests on a foundation that is not entirely secure, and the attentive viewer can feel the slight instability beneath the comedy. The episode in which Mr. Krabs sells 1-cent soda hats, only to realise after the fact that they are rare collectibles worth far more than he sold them for, and then goes to increasingly extraordinary lengths to recover them, is a very clean expression of one of the show's central preoccupations. Greed is the engine of the story, but the episode is careful not to make greed simply stupid. Mr. Krabs' methods are absurd, but his information is correct. The hat really is valuable. The problem is not that he wants to recover it. The problem is what the wanting does to him, how it removes the normal constraints on his behaviour and replaces them with a single focused purpose that cannot accommodate anything else. The episode does not moralise about this. It simply follows the logic to its conclusion, which involves a ghost and a graveyard and an army of bones, and the comedy is in the completeness of the commitment. The show's handling of the relationship between the human world above the water and the undersea world below it is one of its most casually brilliant ongoing choices. The human world exists. It is present in the form of the live-action fishing boat that appears in certain episodes in the shadow of hooks that descend through the water from above. But it is never fully explained or integrated into the world's logic. It simply exists as a fact. The way the surface of the water exists as a fact. The way the presence of air above the sea exists as a fact. The show never pauses to reconcile the fact that people are fishing for fish above a town full of fish who live in houses and attend school. It accepts the contradiction and moves on, and the acceptance is itself a kind of confidence, a signal that the show is not interested in the kinds of explanations that would make the world less rather than more interesting. The voice recording sessions for animation, as they are typically conducted, involve individual actors performing their lines in isolation from the other cast members, responding to earlier recorded tracks or to the direction of the voice director in the booth, rather than to the presence of a scene partner in the room. This method is efficient and practical for the production pipeline, but it creates a specific challenge for comedic material that depends on timing and interaction between characters. The fact that the main cast of this show sounds consistently and convincingly like people who are actually talking to each other rather than people performing scripted dialogue in isolation is a testament both to the skill of the individual performers and to the quality of the direction they received. The timing of exchanges in the best episodes of this period has the quality of improvisation, of people responding to each other in real time, even when the construction of every beat was deliberate and planned. The episode centred on Squidward's attempts to pass off the Krusty Krab as his own fine dining establishment in order to impress a visitor from his past is also, viewed from a certain angle, an episode about the performance of identity. Squidward has always performed a version of himself that is somewhat more accomplished and more appreciated than the evidence supports. The episode simply puts that performance under pressure of a very specific kind, the presence of someone who knew the original material and can therefore evaluate the performance against the reality in a way that random strangers cannot. The episode follows Squidward making increasingly elaborate choices to maintain the gap between his performance and reality, and the comedy is partly in the escalation of those choices and partly in what the choices reveal about what the gap costs him. He has invested so much in the performance that the performance has become, in a way, more important than anything the performance was originally intended to achieve. The episode in which Patrick goes to work each day, while SpongeBob manages the baby scallop at home, is also, viewed through another lens, an episode about the way that trust is built and maintained in a partnership over time, and about what happens when one partner stops being able to see what the other partner is doing. Patrick going to work develops a set of activities that fill the hours he is away, but that have nothing to do with work in the conventional sense, and when SpongeBob asks what he did at work, Patrick answers with those activities honestly and completely, apparently unaware that they do not correspond to what SpongeBob understands work to mean. There is a comedy in this, the straightforward comedy of miscommunication. But beneath it is something slightly more complicated, about the way people can be completely honest and completely unhelpful at the same time, about the way sincerity does not automatically translate into understanding. The backgrounds in these episodes are worth a sustained second look, because they contain a level of detail that rewards the attention paid to them even though, in the original broadcast context, they would have passed by too quickly for most viewers to register consciously. Buildings in Bikini Bottom have histories written in their design. The Krusty Krab's design suggests a repurposed lobster trap, which is both a visual joke and a commentary on Mr. Krabs' relationship to his own establishment. Sandy's dome has the quality of a research station, efficient and utilitarian on the outside, unexpectedly lush and alive on the inside, which is a perfect visual expression of Sandy herself. Squidward's Easter Island head has an expression of permanent, dignified suffering that matches the character who lives inside it so perfectly that it is impossible to imagine any other structure serving the same function. These design choices are not accidental. They are the product of sustained, careful thought about what the visual world of a character can communicate that dialogue and action cannot. The episode in which the whole town is affected by an unusual astronomical phenomenon and everyone reverts to wilder versions of themselves is not, strictly speaking, from this specific period, but the creative instincts that produced it are continuous with the instincts that produced everything we have been discussing. The episode imagines what the familiar characters would be if the accumulated civilization of their lives were stripped away, and the answer, characteristically, is that they would be recognizable but different in very specific ways. SpongeBob, without the infrastructure of his optimism, becomes something feral but not unkind. Patrick, without the infrastructure of his social life, becomes something that is simply Patrick more directly, which turns out to be not so different. The episode is interested in the question of what is essential to a character and what is overlay, and it answers the question through comedy rather than philosophy, which is the only way the show knows how to do it and the only way that actually works. There is a recurring quality in the best episodes of this period that might be described as earned strangeness. The show earns its surreal moments by grounding them in character first, by establishing enough of the emotional logic of a scene that when the scene goes somewhere impossible, the impossibility feels like a natural extension of the emotional truth rather than a departure from it. The sequence in which SpongeBob imagines all the ways his life might go wrong while trying to deliver a pizza is earned by the way the episode has established the stakes, the way it has made SpongeBob's commitment to his mission clear enough that the imagination of failure is genuinely threatening to him, even if it is also very funny to the viewer. The strangeness works because the character work underneath it is solid. The relationship between the show and its music during this period is inseparable from the show's overall effect, and it is worth talking about the specific way the music shapes the emotional experience of watching these episodes even now. The cues are not subtle. The show uses music with a directness that is part of its visual grammar, underscore that comments on the action rather than simply accompanying it, that sometimes runs against the emotional register of what is happening on screen for comic effect, that uses familiar genres and familiar sounds to orient the viewer's emotional response before the images have fully landed. A Hawaiian guitar enters, and we are in the world immediately. A slightly sinister minor key variation on that same sound, and we know something is about to go wrong. The music is a language, and after 20-some years, the audience is fluent in it in ways they may not consciously recognize. There is a particular episode in this run that takes the show's relationship with its own genre and form and turns it into the subject of the episode itself. The episode, structured as a training video for Krusty Krab employees, is this episode, but it is not the only one. The show's willingness to experiment with format, to tell a story using the conventions of a completely different kind of media artifact, is one of the things that kept it vital and surprising during a period when many animated programs of its generation had settled into a steady state of diminishing returns. The show kept asking itself what else it could do with the basic elements at its disposal, what other shapes the story could take, what other styles of address were available to it within the format of a 22-minute program with commercial breaks. The episode in which SpongeBob adopts the abrasive side personality is not from this period either, but the character questions it raises about SpongeBob's fundamental nature are questions that this period had been exploring in its own ways throughout. What is SpongeBob without his openness and his warmth? What is he when the warmth is removed and only the competence remains? The show's answer, delivered through the plot mechanics of a physical product, is that he is someone else entirely, someone who is not SpongeBob in any meaningful way, despite occupying the same body. The warmth is not a quality SpongeBob has on top of who he is. The warmth is who he is, and the other things, the skill, the enthusiasm, the dedication, are only meaningful in the context it provides. The show's relationship to Bikini Bottom as a community, as opposed to simply a setting, is part of what gives it the quality of a real place rather than a constructed one. The background characters have consistent designs that reappear across episodes. The same faces populate the same locations in ways that suggest routines and histories and lives being lived in the margins of the main story. The waiter, who always appears in certain restaurant scenes, has a distinctive look and a specific quality of impatient dignity. The fish who appears in multiple crowd scenes, always seeming to be on his way somewhere, has accumulated across multiple appearances a kind of incidental personality that the show never had to articulate, because the simple fact of his consistent presence communicated it. These characters are background, but background in a well-realized world is not neutral, it is evidence. It tells you that the world continues to exist when you are not looking directly at it, and that quality of continued existence is what makes a fictional world feel true. The episode in which Mr. Krabs fakes his death for insurance purposes, or believes he may have accidentally killed something and must deal with the consequences, or any of the episodes in which the Krusty Krab's relationship to health and safety regulations becomes a plot point, reflect a specific and consistent aspect of Mr. Krabs' character that the show explores with both comedy and something darker. Mr. Krabs is not a good person. The show is never sentimental enough to pretend otherwise. He will sacrifice the well-being of his employees for profit. He will cut corners on food safety. He will lie to customers, to regulators, to the people he nominally cares about, when the truth would cost him money. And the show presents this not as a character flaw to be corrected, but as a fact of who Mr. Krabs is, as simply what a person who loves money more than anything else looks like when they're interacting with a world that requires them to love other things too. The comedy comes from the gap between what Mr. Krabs does and what the situation actually requires. And sometimes, very occasionally, the darkness of what the gap implies surfaces through the comedy in a way that gives the viewer a moment of unexpected moral clarity. The episode involving the Mermaid Man's utility belt and SpongeBob's accidental use of it to shrink various characters to miniature size is notable for the specific way it handles the consequences of carelessness. SpongeBob did not mean to do what he did. His intentions throughout are, as they always are, good, and yet the consequences of his carelessness are real and affect real people in ways that his good intentions cannot simply undo. The episode is a comedy, and the resolution is comedic, but the underlying structure of the situation is honest. Good intentions do not neutralize real consequences. The people who have been shrunk are still small. The problem is real, and SpongeBob has to deal with the real problem rather than simply being forgiven for having meant well. The specific quality of light in Bikini Bottom during this period is worth one more note before we draw toward the end of this long, slow journey through what these episodes contain. The light in these episodes has a particular golden hour quality, the light of late afternoon filtered through warm water that gives every scene a specific emotional temperature. It is the temperature of something that matters, of a world that has weight and history, of time that is moving at a pace you can appreciate. The choice to give Bikini Bottom This quality of light is an emotional decision as much as an aesthetic one. It says something about the show's relationship to its own world, about the affection the people making it had for the place they had created. They lit it the way you light something you love. There are moments in these episodes that are simply beautiful, that exist without any particular narrative function except to be beautiful. A wide shots of jellyfish fields in the late afternoon, the jellyfish drifting in their slow, luminous way through the water, the grass below them catching the light, a close-up of Sandy's dome from outside, the impossible oak tree visible through the glass, the air inside that looks thick with life, the view from the top of a hill in Bikini Bottom, looking down over the rooftops and the streets, the world small and complete, and entirely itself. The show does not announce these moments. It does not slow down to call your attention to them. They are simply there, part of the ongoing argument the show is making, quietly and without urgency, that this world is worth paying attention to, that it contains more than the plot requires, that there is something in it worth looking at even when nothing much is happening. That is, in the end, what the best of these episodes offer. Not just comedy, though the comedy is often brilliant. Not just character, though the characters are genuinely well made, but the specific quality of a world that feels inhabited, that feels like somewhere real people live and have their real small dramas and their real small joys, and that treats those small things with the seriousness they deserve, and no more than that. A world in which a seahorse matters, and a lost dollar matters, and a snowball fight matters, and a box matters, not because these things are grand, but because they are real to the people experiencing them, and the show respects that reality. Let yourself drift now. The details of the day are far away. The things that will require your attention tomorrow can wait until tomorrow. Right now, there is just the quiet of a world beneath the water, where the light is always warm and the pineapple is always glowing, and somewhere in the distance, in jellyfish fields, the jellyfish are doing their slow, unhurried thing, drifting on currents that have been running since long before anyone started watching, and that will keep running long after. Sleep well. Thank you for being here tonight. Subscribe if this is a place you would like to return to, and we will see you again soon. There is a specific quality of attention that the best animation demands from the people making it, a quality that has nothing to do with speed or efficiency, and everything to do with the willingness to care about things that most production pipelines would classify as too small to matter. The angle of a shadow on a background painting, the specific curve of a character's mouth in a moment that lasts a third of a second before the cut. The way a piece of incidental music enters a scene, whether it arrives on the beat or just slightly after it, and what that timing difference does to the emotional register of the moment. These are the kinds of decisions that define the texture of a piece of animation without ever being named by the audience watching it, and the accumulation of those decisions across an entire episode, across an entire season, across the specific stretch of episodes we have been exploring tonight, is what gives the work the quality it has. It is the quality of something made by people who are paying attention to the things that did not strictly require their attention, and who paid that attention anyway, because they understood that the texture of a thing is indistinguishable from the thing itself. The episode in which SpongeBob is tasked with watching over a baby clam while the parents go out is one of those episodes that works almost entirely through the gap between SpongeBob's expectations and the reality of the situation. SpongeBob approaches the task with his characteristic combination of enthusiasm and total confidence in his own readiness, and the episode then systematically and very specifically demonstrates that his readiness does not correspond to the actual demands of the situation. The baby clam is not cooperative. It is not charmed by SpongeBob's warmth. It has needs that are specific and urgent and entirely indifferent to his feelings about having them. And SpongeBob, who has never encountered a situation that his fundamental optimism could not eventually navigate, encounters in this episode a situation that his optimism can certainly navigate, but that will extract a price for the navigation that he did not anticipate paying. The episode is a comedy about childcare, and it works as a comedy, and it also works as something more precise than that. A portrait of someone confronting for the first time the difference between wanting to be capable of something and actually being capable of it. The specific way the show handles Patrick's relationship with food is worth a note on its own, because it is one of the most consistent and most carefully deployed character details in the series. Patrick eats. Patrick eats with a completeness and a commitment that suggests someone for whom the act of eating carries a significance beyond simple sustenance. He eats things that are not food. He eats things that are clearly not his. He approaches meals with the same quality of focused presence he brings to almost nothing else in his life, which means that the eating scenes are, paradoxically, some of the scenes in which Patrick is most fully himself, most clearly the character the show has built him to be. The voice performance in these moments has a specific register of contentment that Bill Fagerback deploys with great precision, a sound that communicates total absorption in the present moment, which is, when you think about it, something most of us spend a great deal of effort trying to achieve and rarely quite manage. The background music that plays during the scenes set at the Goo Lagoon beach has a quality of summerness that is worth sitting with, because it is one of the show's most successful uses of music as a kind of emotional shorthand. The specific combination of steel drums and light percussion and the way they are mixed against the ambient sound of water creates a very specific feeling, the feeling of a place where the urgency of ordinary life has been suspended and something slower and warmer has taken its place. The show uses this music with restraint, which is part of why it works. It does not play it constantly. It reserves it for the moments when it needs to establish that specific quality of ease, that specific temperature of a day that has decided to be good. And because it is reserved, it retains its power across all the episodes that use it. There is a particular recurring visual in these episodes that functions as a kind of emotional signature for the show's relationship to its own world. It is the wide establishing shot of Bikini Bottom as a whole, pulled back far enough that you can see the rooftops and the streets and the general arrangement of the town before the episode zooms in to whatever specific story is about to begin. This shot appears in many episodes, sometimes with slight variations depending on the time of day the episode is set in or the specific weather. If the show is doing weather, which it occasionally does in ways that suggest the sky above the ocean is not entirely disconnected from the water below it. The shot does several things simultaneously. It orients the viewer. It reminds them where they are. It reasserts the show's sense of itself as a place, rather than simply a setting. And it has, across dozens of repetitions, accumulated a kind of resonance that makes every new appearance of it feel like arriving somewhere, rather than simply watching something begin. The episode in which SpongeBob and Squidward are left alone together at the Krusty Krab overnight, for reasons that the episode establishes with its characteristic economy of setup, is one of the more interesting explorations of what these two characters are to each other when the normal social architecture that structures their interactions is removed. The Krusty Krab at night is not the same place as the Krusty Krab during business hours. The light is different, the sounds are different, the atmosphere is different, and in that different atmosphere, without Mr. Krabs and without customers and without the ordinary pressures of the working day, the two characters find themselves in a space that neither of them has a fully established protocol for navigating. The episode uses this space with intelligence. It does not force a warmth between them that would be false to who they are, but it finds something genuine in the specific quality of two people who irritate each other, tolerating each other in a circumstance that requires tolerance, and the something genuine is more interesting than the warmth would have been. The costume episode, in which SpongeBob and Patrick acquire special sprays that render them invisible and use this new capability to play pranks on their neighbours is notable partly for the specific way it handles the escalation from harmless fun to something that has gotten genuinely out of hand. The transition happens gradually enough that at each individual step, the two characters can reasonably tell themselves that they are still within the acceptable range of behaviour, and then the episode allows you to see, from the outside, that the acceptable range has been left behind several steps ago. This is a very specific kind of comedy, the comedy of gradual, consensual escalation, and it requires both the writer and the audience to hold two simultaneous perspectives. The perspective of the characters, who cannot quite see where they are, and the perspective of the viewer, who can. The episode manages this balance without condescension, which is the difficult thing about it, and the resolution, spectacular as it is, does not feel like a punishment so much as a consequence, which is exactly the right distinction. The episode in which SpongeBob gets a job at the Goo Lagoon as a lifeguard, despite not knowing how to swim with the freedom the job requires, is also an episode about the specific tension between wanting to be seen a certain way and being what you actually are. SpongeBob's need to maintain the appearance of competence in the role drives the episode's plot, but the interesting thing about the episode is the way it makes clear that the need is not about the job itself. SpongeBob is not primarily worried about the professional consequences of being found out. He is worried about the social consequences, about what it would mean for how he is perceived, about whether the version of himself that other characters have come to know and to rely on would survive the revelation. This is a recognisably human anxiety delivered through the vehicle of a sponge trying to fake lifeguarding ability, and the delivery works because the anxiety is real, even if the vehicle is absurd. The specific design of the Krusty Krab as a building is worth more attention than it typically receives in discussions of the show's visual world. The building is, as noted, clearly based on the design of a lobster trap, with the entrance framed to suggest the funnel of a trap designed to bring things in rather than let them out. This is a visual joke, and a very good one, about the nature of Mr. Krabs' establishment and his relationship to his customers. But it is also a functional design that communicates information every time it appears on screen. The exterior of the building has a slightly weathered quality, not dilapidated but worn, the quality of something that has been in use for a long time and is valued for its function rather than its appearance. The interior is larger than the exterior would seem to allow, which is a standard animated convention, but one that the show deploys with the specific effect of suggesting that the Krusty Krab contains more than it appears to from the outside, which is true in both the literal architectural sense and the emotional sense. The relationship between animation as a medium and the specific kind of comedy it is uniquely equipped to produce is something that the best episodes of this period demonstrate with particular clarity. Live-action comedy is constrained by physics. The things a human body can do, the ways a face can move, the timing available within the bounds of what actual bodies in actual spaces can accomplish, constitute a set of limits that comedy has to work within, and at its best, work against in interesting ways. Animation has no such limits. The body can do anything. Physics is optional. Time can be stretched or compressed at will, and the comedy available in a world where these things are true is categorically different from the comedy available in a world where they are not. The show during this period understood this advantage and used it with intelligence and with joy, deploying the freedoms of the medium at the moments when those freedoms could produce something that no other medium could produce. The episode in which Squidward enters a talent competition, believing with complete and unshakable confidence that his clarinet performance will be received as the masterwork it clearly is in his own assessment, is an episode that the show navigates with more care than the premise might suggest. The comedy of Squidward's delusion is available throughout, and the show takes it. But the episode also holds something else, a genuine acknowledgement that the courage required to perform something you have made in front of people who might not receive it well is real courage, regardless of the objective quality of the thing being performed. Squidward performs. His confidence in the performance is absolute. And what the episode does with that confidence, how it allows the audience to hold simultaneously the comedy of the delusion and the integrity of the act, is one of the things that keeps the character from becoming simply a figure of fun. The specific quality of SpongeBob's laugh is one of those details that has become so deeply embedded in cultural memory that it is difficult to hear it with fresh ears, but it is worth trying. The laugh is high and slightly staccato, a rapid series of sounds that has the quality of someone who has been genuinely surprised by their own amusement, who did not see the funny thing coming and is now entirely helpless in the face of it. It is one of the most recognizable sounds in the history of animated television, and it has been reproduced and referenced and parodied so many times that the original has been somewhat obscured by its echoes. But in the episodes themselves, delivered by Tom Kenny with the specific timing and the specific quality of genuine delight, it still does what it always did, which is communicate a joy so complete and so undefended that it is difficult not to feel some version of it yourself. The episode in which Patrick competes in a talent competition of his own, with results that are both terrible and spectacular in a way that only Patrick's specific relationship to the concept of self-evaluation could produce, is one of those episodes that the show earns entirely through character consistency. Patrick's conviction that his talent is real is not performed. It is not ironic. It is simply Patrick being Patrick, which means it is simply Patrick understanding himself through a framework in which the question of objective quality has never arisen and is unlikely to arise now. The comedy comes from the gap between his self-assessment and the audience's assessment. But the episode never lets that gap become cruelty, because it never stops being clear that Patrick is genuinely happy, genuinely present, genuinely experiencing the moment exactly as he believes it is. There is a specific quality to the relationship between Sandy and SpongeBob that distinguishes it from SpongeBob's other friendships in ways that reward examination. Sandy and SpongeBob are both genuinely competent people in the specific areas where their competence lies, and they share a quality of enthusiasm for what they do that the other characters in the main cast do not always have. Squidward's enthusiasm for his art is real, but it is freighted with the weight of his expectations for what the art should do for him. Mr. Krabs' enthusiasm for money is real, but it is oriented outward, toward acquisition, rather than inward, toward the pleasure of the thing itself. Sandy and SpongeBob, when they are enthusiastic in a way that is complete and self-contained, that does not need external validation to sustain itself. And this similarity creates between them a specific kind of ease, a friendship between equals that the show does not have to work to maintain, because the characters' natures sustain it without effort. The karate episodes, of which there are several across the run of the series, are interesting as a unit because they consistently use the physical discipline of karate as a vehicle for exploring something about the nature of playfulness and competition and the relationship between them. Karate in the show's universe is something SpongeBob and Sandy do together because they enjoy it. It is play that has the form of combat without the content, because neither of them is actually trying to hurt the other, and both of them know it. The episodes that put this arrangement under pressure, that introduce a context in which the play might tip into something with higher stakes, are interesting precisely because they take the disruption seriously, because they recognise that the things we do with people we care about can carry a weight that the activities themselves do not always announce. The specific period of production that we have been spending time with tonight also coincided with a period in the broader culture of animation in which a number of programs were exploring what children's television could do, what subjects it could engage with, and what emotional registers it could reach. The show was not alone in this exploration, but it was one of the most consistent and most successful practitioners of the particular kind of seriousness beneath the comedy that characterizes the best of this era. The seriousness was never earnest in a way that announced itself. It was always underneath the comedy, available to be found by viewers who were ready to find it, and entirely invisible to viewers who were not, which is exactly the right relationship for a children's programme to have with its own depth. The writer's room during this period operated with a collaborative generosity that is not always present in television production, where the pressures of schedule and ego can turn the creative process into something more adversarial than it needs to be. The writers on this show, working within the specific vision that Hillenburg had established, seemed to have developed a genuine shared ownership of the world they were building, a sense that the contribution of each person in the room was being taken seriously and was expected to make the work better rather than simply to fill the required word count. This quality of collaborative generosity is something you can feel in the episodes, in the way the stories have an internal consistency that suggests everyone working on them understood the same things about the characters and the world, in the way even the smaller moments feel like they were chosen with care rather than inserted as filler. The episode in which Mr. Krabs discovers that he can make more money by charging for things that have always been free, and proceeds to do so with an enthusiasm that rapidly spirals into a level of monetization that even his own employees find troubling, is one of the show's most direct examinations of what unchecked greed looks like when it is given full operational freedom. The comedy is in the escalation, as it often is in episodes centered on Mr. Krabs. But the escalation here goes further and faster than it usually does, arriving at a place where the logic of pure extraction has overridden all other considerations, and the results are both very funny, and if you are watching with a certain quality of attention, genuinely unpleasant in a way that the show deliberately does not resolve into simple comfort. Mr. Krabs is not redeemed at the end of this episode. He is simply stopped. The greed continues, contained only by circumstance rather than character, and the distinction matters. The visual joke that the show makes most consistently across this run of episodes is the joke of scale. The way the characters' sizes relative to their environment shifts based on the needs of the moment without any acknowledgement of the inconsistency. SpongeBob's pineapple house is, in some shots, small enough that SpongeBob standing outside it is of comparable size. In other shots, the interior of the pineapple contains multiple large rooms with high ceilings that could not possibly fit inside the exterior we have been shown. The Krusty Krab is sometimes a modest establishment and sometimes a space of considerable grandeur. These inconsistencies are not errors, they are choices, and the choice is always the same. The correct scale for a given shot is the scale that makes the shot the most visually interesting, or the most emotionally resonant, or the most immediately funny. The show never worries about whether the scales are consistent between shots, because worrying about that would require the show to prioritize a kind of spatial logic that would make it less good at the things it is actually trying to do. The episode in which Sandy builds a rocket and takes some of the other characters on a journey that goes somewhere unexpected is an episode about the intersection of scientific ambition and the unpredictable nature of what happens when you go somewhere you have never been before. Sandy's preparations are meticulous. Her calculations are correct. The mission proceeds according to plan, right up to the point at which plans, as they always eventually do, encounter reality. And reality turns out to have details that the plan did not include. The episode handles this with the good humour that the show always brings to the gap between preparation and outcome, and it allows Sandy to navigate the unexpected with the combination of scientific flexibility and personal resilience that defines her character. The joy of the episode is partly in the destination and partly in watching someone confront a surprise from a foundation of actual competence, which is a different and more interesting thing than watching someone confront a surprise from a foundation of panic. There is a recurring visual motif across several of the episodes in this period that involves the use of extreme close-up shots to deliver a specific kind of comedy that the show has made very much its own. These shots, pulled in so close that details of texture become visible that would normally be invisible, are used most often for moments of physical grossness, the kind of cartoonishly detailed biological information that the show deploys with great confidence and great precision. The shots are jarring in a way that is part of their function. They interrupt the visual register of the episode with something that is too much, too close, too detailed, and the comedy comes from the interruption as much as from the content. The show understood early that the distance between cute and grotesque in animation is much shorter than it appears, and that crossing that distance deliberately at the right moment with the right subject produces a specific kind of laughter that nothing else produces. The friendship between SpongeBob and Patrick, viewed across the entire run of the show, but particularly through the episodes in this period, is one of the most carefully sustained emotional relationships in the series. It is not a friendship between equals in any of the conventional ways that friendships between equals are measured. SpongeBob is more capable than Patrick in most of the ways the world measures capability. He is more articulate, more responsible, more aware of his own actions and their consequences, more reliably able to navigate the social world that both of them inhabit. And yet the friendship is not patronising, and it is not one-sided. What Patrick offers to SpongeBob, and what the show understands clearly without ever stating it, is a quality of acceptance that SpongeBob does not always find elsewhere. Patrick does not require SpongeBob to be anything other than what he is. He does not have expectations that SpongeBob must manage. He simply shows up every day in the uncomplicated way of someone for whom friendship is not a performance or a negotiation, but simply a fact of life, and he is there, and that there-ness is the gift. The specific challenge of writing comedy for a character like Patrick is the challenge of making the joke work without the joke being on Patrick. The show, at its best during this period, managed this consistently. Patrick is funny because the world, as he experiences it, is genuinely different from the world as other characters experience it, and the comedy comes from the collision between his version of reality and theirs rather than from the sense that his version is simply wrong and theirs is simply right. In the best episodes, Patrick's understanding of a situation, however unorthodox, turns out to contain a kind of practical wisdom that the more apparently rational characters have missed. The box episode is the clearest example of this, but it appears throughout the run in smaller moments in the specific way the show allows Patrick's approach to a problem to occasionally produce results that the conventional approach would not have reached. The episode in which SpongeBob faces down the prospect of being an adult in a way he does not want to be, in which the gap between who he is and who the world keeps suggesting he should be becomes a source of genuine discomfort, is one of the episodes that speaks most directly to the experience of being young and watching the world attempt to reshape you. SpongeBob is not interested in the maturity that the episode initially associates with adulthood, not because he is immature in any harmful way, but because the version of maturity being offered does not correspond to anything he values. The episode is careful not to endorse either position entirely, which is what makes it interesting. Being SpongeBob is not presented as the only acceptable way to be, but it is presented as a legitimate way to be, as a way that has its own integrity and its own worth, and the episode's ultimate orientation is toward that integrity rather than away from it. The visual design of Plankton is worth considering, alongside the visual design of Mr. Krabs, because the two characters are designed in direct opposition to each other, and the opposition is informative. Mr. Krabs is large, physically imposing in the context of the show's scale, built around the visual language of acquisition and possession, claws that reach and grasp, eyes that evaluate. Plankton is tiny, almost invisibly small, built around the visual language of aspiration and resentment, the specific shape of someone who has had to work harder than anyone for every small success, and who has still come up short. The physical contrast between the two characters communicates their relationship before either of them speaks, and it frames the entire history of their rivalry in terms that are both immediately funny and genuinely illuminating. The powerful one is not more deserving. The small one is not less capable. The gap between them is circumstantial, a matter of scale rather than merit. And the show, at its best, holds this complexity without simplifying it. Mr. Lawrence, who voices Plankton, has spoken about the character as a performance of appetite, of someone who wants so badly that the wanting has become the primary fact of their existence, more real than any specific thing wanted. The voice is small and slightly strained, with the quality of something pushing against its own limits, and it carries the specific combination of genius and frustration and occasional, terrible sincerity that makes Plankton one of the show's most interesting secondary characters. There is a scene in one of the episodes from this period in which Plankton, briefly and genuinely, has what he wants, and the performance in that scene is extraordinary, because Lawrence plays it not with triumph, but with the bewildered quiet of someone who does not quite know what to do with the thing they have spent so long wanting now that they have it. The episode in which SpongeBob becomes briefly obsessed with a particular hobby that takes over his entire life is one of those episodes that the show knows how to do very well because it understands obsession from the inside. SpongeBob's enthusiasms are never casual. When he is interested in something, he is entirely interested in it, in the way that the naturally curious and naturally enthusiastic engage with things that capture their attention. The episode explores what happens when that quality of total engagement is directed at something that the world around him does not share, and what it costs, both to SpongeBob and to the people around him, when the engagement tips from charming to overwhelming. The episode is honest about this cost without making SpongeBob wrong for having the enthusiasm. It simply shows what enthusiasm looks like from the outside and allows the viewer to hold both perspectives. The episode in which a simple misunderstanding about a word or phrase cascades through the entire Krusty Krab staff, with results that escalate far beyond what any single misunderstanding could reasonably produce, is one of those episodes that demonstrates the show's ability to build a complex comedic structure from the most minimal initial materials. The misunderstanding is established cleanly and early. The rules of how it will spread are implied rather than stated, which means the audience is always slightly ahead of the characters and can anticipate the next escalation before it arrives, which is a different and in some ways more sophisticated relationship between comedy and audience than the surprise of an unexpected twist. The pleasure is in the watching the inevitable arrive, in the satisfaction of seeing the structure complete itself exactly as it must. The specific way the show uses music to mark the transitions between emotional registers within a single episode is one of its most sophisticated tools, and one of the hardest to describe precisely. Within a single 11-minute episode, the musical tone might shift a dozen times, from the warmth of an establishing theme to the slight menace of a minor key variation, to the comedic percussion of a physical gag sequence, to the quiet intimacy of a character moment, to the grand orchestral swell of a false resolution. Each transition is made smoothly, in a way that the viewer feels rather than notices, and the effect is that the episode moves through emotional states without any of the transitions feeling jarring or arbitrary. The music is doing the work of a film score in a fraction of the running time, and with a fraction of the budget, and it does it with a consistency and a quality that reflects both the skill of the composers and the specificity of the brief they were given. The town of Bikini Bottom, taken as a whole, across all the episodes of this period, has a geography that is slightly inconsistent in the details but entirely consistent in the feeling. The specific distances between locations change depending on the needs of a given episode's pacing. The layout of the town as a whole shifts. Landmarks appear and disappear without ceremony. And none of this matters because the feeling of Bikini Bottom, the specific warmth and strangeness of the place, is entirely consistent from episode to episode. And the feeling is what the show's actually asking you to carry. You can navigate Bikini Bottom emotionally long before you could navigate it physically, and the emotional navigation is the one that counts. There is something in these episodes that might be described as a philosophy of small things, a consistent orientation toward the idea that the things that seem too small to matter are often the things that matter most. SpongeBob's love of fry cooking is small in the world's accounting, and the show does not pretend otherwise. The world is full of things that seem to matter more, and yet the episodes return again and again to the idea that the quality of attention you bring to the specific thing you have decided to care about is more important than the grandeur of the thing itself, that fry cooking done with love and precision and genuine investment is more valuable than many things done more impressively from a greater distance. This is a philosophy that takes a while to fully appreciate, that becomes more rather than less resonant as the viewer gets older, and it is one of the things that makes the show feel different at 35 than it did at 8, not lesser, but larger. The moments in these episodes when the comedy breaks and something else comes through, when the show touches something real without the protection of the joke, are some of the most memorable moments in the run. They are brief. The show does not linger in them, but they are genuine, and they leave a mark that persists long after the episode has ended and the details have begun to blur. A specific look on SpongeBob's face when he realizes that someone he cares about does not feel what he feels. The specific quality of Squidward's stillness in a moment when the performance of not caring is not quite working. The specific way Gary's eyes track his owner when SpongeBob does not know he is being watched. These moments are not what the episodes are about, in any summary-ready sense, but they are what the episodes are made of, in the deepest sense, and they are what makes them last. The night is fully quiet now. The water above Bikini Bottom is still. The light through it, that particular golden light, is at its softest. The town is at rest in the way that places rest when the business of the day has run out, and the business of tomorrow has not yet begun. SpongeBob is asleep in his pineapple, with Gary curled on his small bed nearby. Patrick is under his rock, dreaming something that is probably simple and probably pleasant. Sandy's dome is dark, her equipment quiet. The Krusty Krab is locked and still, and the grill is cold. Squidward is sitting in the half-light of his own house, with his clarinet across his knees, and he is not playing it, and the silence is, for him, a kind of peace. Let yourself go the rest of the way now. The story has been told. The world is as complete as it needs to be. You have been carried somewhere warm and strange and quietly beautiful, and you can stay here as long as you like, because Bikini Bottom will wait for you, as it always has, without urgency, without complaint, without needing anything from you in return. The jellyfish drift. The water holds everything. The light is golden, and it is always golden, and it will always be golden. And that constancy is a kind of gift, and the gift is yours, and tonight it is exactly enough. There is something worth examining in the specific way the show handles the character of Gary across this run of episodes that goes beyond what any individual Gary-focused plot reveals on its own. Gary is present in almost every episode in some capacity, even if only in a single establishing shot of SpongeBob's pineapple interior, and his presence in those shots carries more emotional information than a single background animal character has any obvious obligation to carry. The way Gary is positioned in a room communicates something about the temperature of the household. When SpongeBob is happy, Gary tends to appear comfortable and settled. When SpongeBob is in crisis, Gary tends to appear alert, slightly elevated, the posture of an animal that is paying attention, because it has learned that paying attention matters. None of this is stated, none of it is commented upon by any character. It is simply there, in the animation, as a layer of visual information that rewards the viewer who is watching carefully and does nothing to disrupt the experience of the viewer who is not. The episode in which SpongeBob temporarily loses confidence in his cooking ability, throwing the Krusty Krab into a crisis that Mr. Krabs is not equipped to manage because Mr. Krabs has never had to manage it before, is one of the run's most economical expressions of how the show thinks about skill and identity. SpongeBob's cooking is not simply a job, it is the primary expression of who he is and how he engages with the world. It is the context within which his optimism and his precision and his genuine love for the people he serves find their most complete realization. Taking that away, even temporarily, does not simply create a plot problem, it creates an existential problem. And the episode tracks the existential problem with a care that is characteristic of the show at its best, following SpongeBob through the crisis, not just to the point where the plot is resolved, but to the point where the character has been restored to himself, which is a different and more important destination. The sequence of scenes set in the Krusty Krab during the morning rush, the period before customers arrive, when SpongeBob is preparing the kitchen and Squidward is preparing himself for another day of being there, is one of the show's most quietly observed recurring tableaux. These scenes are not the focus of any specific episode. They are establishing material, transitional tissue, the moments between the moments, and yet they have been built with enough specificity and enough consistency that they carry their own emotional weight. You know what these mornings feel like from the inside. You know the specific quality of the Krusty Krab in the hour before the door opens, the way the light sits in the space, the sounds of the kitchen, the particular quality of a routine so ingrained that it proceeds without conscious thought. These details accumulate across episodes, without any single episode bearing full responsibility for establishing them. And the accumulation is one of the things that makes Bikini Bottom feel inhabited rather than merely depicted. The episode most closely associated with Squidward's aspiration to be recognised as an artist, the one in which he has a genuine opportunity to present his work to someone who might actually understand it, is also the episode that most honestly confronts the difference between the version of recognition Squidward has always imagined and the version that turns out to be available. The recognition that arrives is real. The person offering it is sincere, and Squidward's response to it is complicated in a way that the episode allows to be complicated rather than simplifying it into a lesson. He does not know how to receive what is being offered because what is being offered does not fit the shape of what he's been wanting. He has spent so long wanting a specific kind of recognition that the arrival of a different kind, however genuine, creates a dissonance rather than a resolution. The episode does not resolve this dissonance, it simply presents it, and the presentation is honest. There is a specific quality in the relationship between SpongeBob's optimism and the world's indifference to it that makes SpongeBob one of the most philosophically interesting characters in animated television, though the show would almost certainly not describe it in those terms. SpongeBob encounters resistance constantly. The world around him is not reliably responsive to his enthusiasm or his warmth. Squidward resists him. Mr. Krabs exploits him. The customers at the Krusty Krab are often indifferent or actively rude. The broader population of Bikini Bottom is frequently hostile to his specific quality of engaged, relentless positivity, and yet SpongeBob persists. Not because he is unaware of the resistance, he is clearly aware of it. Not because he's incapable of being hurt, he is clearly capable of being hurt, and the show allows him to be hurt in ways that are brief but real. He persists because his orientation toward the world is not contingent on the world's response. It is simply how he is and the steadiness of it. The quality of someone who has found a way to be that does not require external validation to sustain itself is the closest thing the show has to a central argument. The music that plays during scenes set in the open water outside Bikini Bottom, in the vast expanse beyond the town's edges, has a quality that is distinct from the music of the town itself. It is more open, slightly more suspended, with the quality of space that is not organised around human activity, that exists on its own terms and in its own time. These musical cues appear in the episodes that take the characters out of the familiar world into the places beyond the ordinary geography of Bikini Bottom, and they do the work of establishing the emotional texture of the unfamiliar quickly and without requiring anything else. You hear that music and you know you are somewhere that is not the town, somewhere that has different rules and a different quality of time. And the shift in your attention that the music produces is exactly the shift the episode is asking for. The specific decision to set the show at the bottom of the ocean, rather than in any of the other fantastic locations available to an animated program, was not primarily a visual decision, though it produced visual qualities that proved essential to what the show became. It was primarily a narrative decision, a decision about the relationship between the story's setting and the show's emotional register. An ocean setting means that everything is already, fundamentally, slightly strange. The light is different, the physics are different, the fauna is different in ways that are genuinely bizarre and genuinely beautiful in roughly equal measure. Living at the bottom of the ocean is not a neutral choice, and the characters who live there are not neutral about it. They have organised their lives around a specific environmental reality that produces specific kinds of experience, and the show is about those experiences in the same way that any realistic fiction is about the specific experiences produced by its specific setting. The ocean is not a backdrop, it is the condition. The relationship between the show and its own history of episodes, the way the show references its own earlier material through Easter eggs and callbacks, and the gradual accumulation of a shared world is one of the things that distinguishes this period from what came before and what came after. The show did not always behave as though it had a history that was worth remembering. The earliest episodes were largely self-contained in a way that left little room for the pleasures of recognition and continuity. But by this particular period, the show had been running long enough to have a real history, and the creative team had begun, consciously and deliberately, to treat that history as a resource. The callbacks in these episodes are never obligatory. They never feel like the show checking a continuity box. They feel like the show remembering something it loves and finding a way to let the audience share in that remembering. The episode in which SpongeBob and Patrick try to make a movie or try to produce some kind of creative work together is one of those episodes that the show knows how to do, because the show is a creative work being made by people who have navigated the specific challenges of creative collaboration, and the episode is in some ways a gentle and comedic account of what those challenges feel like from the inside. The gap between the vision and the execution. The way a project that seems simple in conception becomes complex in production. The specific dynamic of collaborative work in which both parties have total conviction in their individual contributions and are not entirely sure how to reconcile those contributions into a coherent whole. The show does not belabor these themes. It delivers them through comedy, through the specific absurdity of SpongeBob and Patrick's working method. But the themes are there, recognizable to anyone who has ever tried to make something with another person. The episode in which the main characters find themselves in a difficult situation because of a sequence of decisions that seemed individually reasonable, but that produced, in combination, an outcome that no single decision could have predicted, is one of the run's better structural comedies. The episode depends on a specific understanding of how consequential logic works, of the way small choices can cascade into large outcomes through the specific mechanism of each choice, foreclosing certain options and making other options more likely. The characters in the episode are not stupid, they are simply operating with incomplete information, and the comedy comes from watching the incomplete information lead them step by step to a place that complete information would never have taken them. The resolution, when it comes, does not come from anyone being smarter. It comes from the situation finally containing enough new information to make the correct path visible. There is a specific moment in many of the best episodes of this period, a moment that arrives differently in different episodes but that is recognizable across all of them, which is the moment just before the episode reveals what it has been building toward, the moment of maximal uncertainty before the resolution arrives. The show handles this moment with great skill, holding it exactly long enough to generate the appropriate level of anticipation without holding it so long that the anticipation tips into impatience. The timing of this moment is a craft decision, and it reflects the experience and the instinct of a creative team that has learned exactly how long a pause can breathe before it needs to close. The best comedy is about timing, and timing is about understanding the emotional state of the audience at every moment and making choices that serve that state rather than simply advancing the plot. The specific way the show handles the passing of a day within an episode, the movement from morning to afternoon to evening that many episodes track, is one of its most pleasurable structural pleasures. The Krusty Krab opens in the morning. The day builds, things happen. The light shifts subtly across the episode, from the clear morning quality of the establishing shots to the slightly warmer, slightly lower light of afternoon, to the specific quality of early evening that the show uses to signal that the day is concluding and the episode with it. This temporal arc is not present in every episode. Some episodes are set over a much shorter time span or are indifferent to the time of day entirely, but in the episodes that use it, it gives the story a satisfying shape. The shape of a day complete and self-contained, with a beginning and a middle and an end that corresponds to the natural rhythm of the world. The episode in which SpongeBob receives an award for his work at the Krusty Krab and experiences the specific and slightly disorienting quality of being publicly recognised for something he has always done privately is one of those episodes that the show handles with more emotional precision than the premise suggests. SpongeBob cooks every day with the same quality of attention and the same quality of love, regardless of whether anyone is watching. The award does not change what he does. It simply marks it, makes it visible, transforms what was a private relationship between a person and their work into something that exists in the world outside that relationship. And the episode is interested in the specific question of what that transformation does to the person being recognized, whether the public version of the work can coexist with the private version without damaging either, and how a person who has never needed external validation to sustain their commitment to a thing should relate to the arrival of that validation when it finally comes. The sequence in which SpongeBob demonstrates Krabby Patty making to a new customer for the first time in a given episode is always the same sequence and always somehow fresh because the show has found a way to deliver the same beat, the slap of the patty, the dressing, the presentation, with a consistent energy that does not diminish through repetition. This is a specific achievement. Most repeated actions in animation, repeated often enough, become mechanical. The show avoids this by ensuring that SpongeBob's relationship to the act is never mechanical, that every patty he makes is made with the same quality of attention, the same genuine care, and that the performance communicates this every time. The patty matters to SpongeBob. It always matters. And because it always matters to him, it always matters to the viewer. The light in the final shot of many of these episodes, the wide pullback that shows Bikini Bottom settling into its evening quiet as the credits approach, has a quality that is worth naming specifically, because it is one of the show's most consistent and most beautiful recurring images. The light at this time of day in Bikini Bottom is neither the bright clarity of morning nor the warm gold of midday, but something between them, a quality of illumination that suggests the day has run its course and has been, on balance, worth having. The town below the camera is complete. The stories have concluded. The characters are where they belong. And the light above it all is gentle and unhurried and entirely without demand. The light of a place that is at peace with itself and with the specific quality of the life it contains. That is finally and completely what this particular run of episodes built over the course of its making. Not a mythology, though the world it created has mythological dimensions. Not a philosophy, though the best of its episodes contain genuine philosophical intelligence. Not even a story, exactly, though each episode is a story complete in itself. What it built was a feeling. The specific feeling of a world that is warm and strange and full of small things that matter and people who care about those small things, and a quality of light that is always just right, and a sound that is always just right, and a sense beneath all of it that this is a place worth being, that the time spent here has value, that whatever is happening in the world outside, this specific quality of warmth and attention and quiet joy is real and available and yours. The ocean holds it all. The water is warm. The pineapple glows. The night is yours, and it is gentle, and you can let it take you all the way down into the deepest quiet now, where the light is always golden and nothing is required and everything that has ever mattered is still, somehow exactly where you left it. The show built something rare, something that did not announce its rarity, but simply was it, quietly and without ceremony, in episode after episode, over the course of years of patient, careful, loving work. The people who received it as children carry it differently now than they did then, with more understanding of what it took to make, and more appreciation for the specific quality of the choices that were made. But the feeling is the same feeling. It has not aged. It has not needed to. It was made from something that does not age, from the specific and universal truth that small things done with complete attention and genuine care are more durable than large things done without it, and that the warmth you feel in the presence of that care is real, and that it is yours, and that it will be there whenever you need it. There is one more thing worth saying about this body of work, and it has to do with the specific experience of returning to it as an adult. Most of us who watch these episodes as children are now people who carry them somewhere inside us in a way that does not quite apply to other things we watched at the same age, and with comparable enthusiasm. The episodes have stayed in a way that other things have not, and the reason, when you spend time thinking about it, seems to be that the show was asking real questions all along, and the questions have not gone away. The question of what it means to be genuinely good at something and genuinely happy about it. The way SpongeBob is happy about fry cooking, and the way that happiness is presented not as simple or trivial, but as one of the more difficult and admirable things a person can manage. The question of the gap between who you believe yourself to be and who you are, which is Squidward's question, and which is a question that does not become less urgent as you get older. The question of what it costs to love something without expectation, which is the question the show asks in the background of almost every SpongeBob and Patrick scene. These are not children's questions. They are just questions, and the show was asking them all along, dressed in bright colours and accompanied by ukulele music, in a way that children could feel even if they could not name, and that adults can now recognise for what it was. The specific period we have spent time with tonight produced somewhere between 40 and 50 individual episodes, depending on how you count. And each of those episodes is a complete world that exists in approximately 11 minutes of screen time. The economy required to build a complete world in 11 minutes is extraordinary, and it is a skill that the best writers and directors working on this show during this period had developed to a very high degree. Every line in these episodes is doing work. Every image is doing work. There is no excess in the best of them because the format does not allow for excess, and because the people making them respected the format enough not to try to fight it. They worked within the constraint and found in it a kind of creative pressure that produced clarity, that stripped away everything that was not necessary and left only what was, and what was turned out to be enough. The town of Bikini Bottom will be there tomorrow, exactly as it has always been. The Krusty Krab will open for business. Squidward will arrive at work having already composed himself for disappointment. SpongeBob will arrive having already begun being enthusiastic about the day. Patrick will be somewhere doing something that makes complete sense to Patrick. Sandy will be in her dome, probably building something. Gary will be in SpongeBob's pineapple, managing the household affairs with quiet competence. The world is complete. It does not need anything from you. It will simply be there whenever you want to return to it, exactly as you left it, warm and strange and full of the particular quality of attention that the people who made it poured into every frame. For now, let it wait. Let everything wait. The night is quiet and you have been here long enough to know that you're somewhere safe. Let the breathing slow the rest of the way. Let the day go. The ocean is very deep and very still, and the light through the water is the same golden colour it always is. And somewhere in jellyfish fields, the jellyfish are floating in their slow, unhurried, ancient way, as they have always done and will always do, and there is nothing required of you right now, except to rest, sleep well. There is a kind of beauty in the fact that so many of the people who worked on this particular run of episodes went on to contribute to other beloved animation projects, carrying with them the instincts and the standards they developed here. The writers who learned to compress a complete story into 11 minutes with no room for anything that did not serve the whole. The animators who learned that physical comedy is a language with a grammar and that the grammar must be internalized before it can be played with. The directors who learned that the best choices are almost always the choices that honor what the characters actually are, rather than what the plot needs them to be. All of these skills traveled and continue to travel, and the work done during this period is part of what gave those skills their shape. The specific discipline of this era, the commitment to quality, and the willingness to take the small moments seriously became a kind of inheritance that the people who developed it passed on to the projects that came after. The show during this period was also notable for the way it handled the passage of time within its world. Bikini Bottom does not age. The characters are always exactly who they are, frozen at the particular moment in their lives when the show found them, and the show makes no apology for this. The world is not a linear one. It does not accumulate history in the way that real life accumulates history. Each episode is its own present tense, complete and self-contained, and the world outside each episode's specific story is simply the world, continuous and unchanged. This quality of permanence is part of what gives the show its specific emotional comfort. The sense that whatever else changes in the life of the viewer, Bikini Bottom will be as it was. The pineapple will be where it was. The Krusty Krab will be where it was. The sea will be as warm as it always was. And that permanence, that unchanging quality of a world held in suspension, is part of what makes returning to these episodes feel less like watching television and more like visiting somewhere that has been waiting for you. The final note, the last thing worth saying before the night goes fully quiet, is simply this. The people who made these episodes did their work with care, and the care survived. And that is not a small thing. It is actually a very large thing. Most things made with care do not survive the distance between their creation and the present moment in the way these episodes have. Most things dissolve into the general past and become simply the past unretriever and unrevisited. The fact that these episodes are still here, still playing, still doing the same things they always did, still generating the same feelings in people who have now been carrying them for 25 years, is evidence of something. Of quality, certainly, but also of the specific, irreplaceable quality of work made by people who genuinely loved what they were making and knew why it mattered and did not need to be told to care. That is enough for tonight. The water is warm, the light is golden, and somewhere beneath the surface of the sea, in a town that exists precisely and only in the way that matters most, everything is exactly as it should be. The sound of the ocean is the oldest sound there is. It was there before everything else we know, before language, before fire, before the first story told in the dark to make the dark feel smaller. And somewhere in the specific warmth of Bikini Bottom's light, in the specific quality of the music that plays when the camera drifts over the rooftops of a town that should not exist and does anyway, there is an echo of that original sound. The sound of something large and deep and patient, moving in its own time, indifferent to urgency, indifferent to the small complications of the surface. The show caught that sound and held it for 11 minutes at a time, over and over, across years of patient, careful, loving work. And the sound is still there, still available, still doing what it always did, waiting for you to listen, waiting for you to let it carry you somewhere quiet, which is exactly where you're headed now. Good night. The jellyfish drift. The water holds everything gently. The light through the ocean is always, always golden. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do. The night is full and soft and entirely yours. Let it take you somewhere deep and still and quiet. You are safe. You are here. That is more than enough.